Chicago at night had a rhythm all its own, a quiet pulse that the untrained eye might miss. Streetlights flickered along cracked sidewalks, illuminating graffiti-streaked walls and the occasional shuttered shop. The wind carried faint echoes of sirens, distant laughter, and the soft hum of late-night traffic. In certain neighborhoods, the darkness was not just absence of light but a presence, a careful observer that bore witness to the lives unfolding beneath it. Among those lives, one would come to command attention not through brute force alone, but through a mind that saw strategy where others saw chaos, opportunity where others saw only danger. His name was Larry Hoover. He moved through the South Side not with the swagger of an overtly violent man, but with a presence that demanded respect. The streets knew him, or at least the shadows that carried his influence did. To the casual passerby, he might have seemed like just another young man, blending into the crowds of dimly lit corners and bustling city corners. Yet, beneath that calm exterior was a mind always calculating, always observing, and always planning. Every gesture, every word, every encounter could serve as a building block for a network that would eventually span far beyond the alleys he walked. Even at the start, Hoover's story was not one of immediate notoriety or headline-grabbing violence. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a quiet gathering of allies, a careful measurement of rivals, a study of the structures around him. He had an instinct for people, the rare ability to read intentions without words, to sense threats and opportunities in equal measure. In Chicago's South Side, a place defined by survival, those instincts were more valuable than wealth, more protective than any weapon. And yet, there was a duality in him that would come to define his legend. He was at once part of the chaos and apart from it, both embedded in the underworld and somehow orchestrating it from the shadows. The city itself played a role in shaping him. Chicago's streets were not merely roads, they were arteries of influence, carrying rumors, money, favors, and fear. Hoover learned to navigate them not with brute force alone, but with strategy, discipline, and an uncanny ability to anticipate human behavior. Every street corner held a lesson, every encounter a test. He observed the way gangs operated, the ways alliances formed and broke, the delicate balance of power. To him, every choice, however small, was a step toward building something larger than survival. Something that would endure. There was also a sense of paradox in Hoover's rise, an almost surreal element to the way he blended visibility with invisibility. On the surface, he was a young man living amid poverty and danger. But behind closed doors, in whispered conversations and clandestine meetings, he began to construct a network with the precision of a chess master. Loyalty was currency. Intelligence was power. And patience, perhaps more than anything, was the tool that would carry him further than many of his contemporaries. In a world where impulsive decisions often led to ruin, Hoover learned to wait, to watch, and to act only when the conditions were perfectly aligned. Even in those early days, there were signs that his story would not follow a typical path. He was neither reckless nor overtly violent in a way that demanded attention. Instead, his influence was subtle, spreading through calculated actions and quiet persuasion. Rivals underestimated him, not out of malice, but because they could not see the web he was weaving. Friends and allies recognized it, though they could not fully grasp the scale of his vision. To the casual observer, it might have seemed like he was merely surviving. But in reality, he was laying the foundation for a legacy that would stretch across decades, that would endure even beyond the walls of prison, that would touch lives far beyond the immediate reach of his presence. The paradox of Larry Hoover's rise was that it seemed almost invisible at first. There was no loud proclamation, no sudden headline to mark the beginning of a kingpin's ascent. Instead, it was a quiet storm, gathering momentum in the overlooked spaces of the city. Every whispered conversation, every strategic alliance, every carefully measured step was a thread in a tapestry that only he could see in its entirety. It was in this quiet accumulation of influence, in this patient orchestration of people and events, that the seeds of a nation behind bars were sown. Even now, decades later, the image of Larry Hoover moving through Chicago's South Side evokes a sense of calm tension, of a man who was always present yet never fully exposed. One could imagine him walking past flickering neon signs, past the hum of late-night shops, past kids playing in dimly lit alleys, all the while observing, calculating, and planning. And in that quiet observation lay the secret to his power. Unlike many who relied solely on intimidation, Hoover relied on vision. He could see the consequences of actions not just in the moment, but years into the future. He could see patterns where others saw only chaos, opportunities where others saw only risk. This was the beginning, the moment before the rise, the calm before the storm. Chicago, with all its grit and danger, its shadows and hidden opportunities, was both the playground and the proving ground for a man who would one day build a nation behind steel bars. Larry Hoover's story was not merely one of crime, it was a story of intellect, patience, and the quiet orchestration of power. And it all began here, in the still, flickering streets of a city that would never forget the empire quietly rising among its alleys and corners. Larry Hoover's early life unfolded against the raw, unfiltered backdrop of Chicago's South Side, a place where the air seemed thick with both possibility and peril. The streets were alive with a constant hum of activity, a mixture of children's laughter, vendors calling out their wares, the distant rumble of trains, and the occasional sharp echo of sirens cutting through the night. It was a neighborhood defined as much by its hardships as by its vibrant community, a place where survival was taught as a lesson in every cracked sidewalk and graffiti-streaked wall. For a young boy growing up here, every day was a balancing act between innocence and pragmatism, between childhood dreams and the unspoken knowledge that the world beyond the South Side often ignored those who lived within it. From an early age, Larry demonstrated an awareness that seemed beyond his years. He noticed patterns in the behavior of the people around him, learned to read expressions, gestures, and unspoken tensions. He watched older boys navigate the streets with a mix of caution and confidence, sometimes exploiting opportunities and sometimes falling prey to dangers he instinctively understood needed to be avoided. In those formative moments, he began to internalize the rules of the streets: when to speak, when to stay silent, when to assert yourself, and when to step back. Unlike many children who were swept along passively by circumstance, Larry was actively observing, mentally cataloging each lesson the environment offered, even if he could not yet articulate it. Family life, though filled with love, was marked by the challenges that came with growing up in a neighborhood where resources were scarce and opportunities limited. Parents worked tirelessly, often juggling multiple jobs, to make ends meet. Larry learned early that responsibility and resourcefulness were not optional, they were necessary. At the same time, the bonds with siblings and extended family were strong, forming an emotional foundation that would later shape his approach to loyalty and community. Even amid scarcity, he saw the value of connection, of trust, and of the unspoken codes that governed human interaction. It was a delicate dance between necessity and affection, one that would leave an indelible mark on the young mind of the future gang leader. By his early teens, Larry had begun to feel the magnetic pull of the streets in ways that were both seductive and dangerous. The neighborhood offered alternatives to the conventional path of school and work, alternatives that promised status, power, and, crucially, survival. Small hustles, selling goods, running errands for older gang members, observing and learning the operations, became his first lessons in enterprise. These were not grandiose schemes, they were carefully measured steps, each one a chance to test instincts, learn from mistakes, and understand human behavior. Even at this stage, his intelligence and calm demeanor set him apart. He did not act recklessly, he observed and adapted, always thinking a step ahead. Violence, an ever-present shadow on the South Side, was not something Larry sought, but he understood it intimately. He learned that to survive, one had to be aware of threats, to recognize the signs of brewing conflicts, and to respond not merely with aggression but with strategy. There was a natural caution in his approach, a sense that brute force alone was insufficient to navigate the complex ecosystem of the streets. In many ways, the neighborhood itself became a classroom, teaching lessons that would later inform his leadership style, the importance of loyalty, the necessity of negotiation, and the strategic use of fear and respect. Despite the pressures of his environment, Larry also exhibited moments of normal adolescence, friendships, laughter, small rebellions, and curiosity about the world beyond his neighborhood. Yet even these seemingly ordinary experiences were filtered through a lens of awareness. Every interaction, every choice, became part of a mental framework he was building, a way of understanding people, their desires, their fears, and their weaknesses. It was a quiet accumulation of knowledge, almost imperceptible to those around him, but foundational for the empire he would one day construct. School provided another dimension to his learning. Though the formal education system was far from perfect and often under-resourced, Larry absorbed what he could. Reading, numbers, and social observation became tools in his arsenal. He understood early that intellect and street smarts were not mutually exclusive, they were complementary. While peers might rely solely on intimidation or bravado, Larry was learning to combine instinct with calculation, emotion with strategy, and action with foresight. These dual skills would become his defining advantage in the years to come. The South Side itself was a teacher, its streets both cruel and instructive. Hoover learned that survival was a matter of awareness and action, that alliances could save a life or seal a fate, and that every decision carried weight. He observed older gang members not simply for admiration but for insight, understanding their motivations, hierarchies, and methods. In doing so, he began to see the structures of power that underpinned the streets, informal rules, codes of loyalty, and systems of influence that, while unwritten, were as binding as any law. Larry did not simply participate, he analyzed, absorbed, and planned. By the time he was entering adolescence, Larry Hoover was no longer just another boy on the South Side. He was a keen observer, a thinker, and a strategist in miniature. The neighborhood, with all its challenges and dangers, had forged in him an understanding of human behavior, resilience, and the power of calculated risk. Every alleyway, every conversation, every cautious glance over a shoulder was a lesson, a piece of a puzzle that would one day define his approach to leadership, crime, and survival. Looking back, it becomes clear that Larry's early years were less about immediate notoriety and more about preparation. The South Side shaped him not into a simple product of his environment but into a man capable of bending that environment to his vision. He learned to navigate danger with intelligence, to command loyalty without brute force, and to see opportunity where others saw only limitation. These lessons, learned quietly in the flickering light of Chicago's streets, were the foundation upon which he would later build a network, an empire, and a legend that would endure far beyond the confines of his early neighborhood. Even in the chaos of his surroundings, there was a calm precision in Larry's observations, a patience that would later define his rise. The streets taught him the stakes, the consequences, and the mechanics of power. They taught him that influence could be wielded quietly, that survival required strategy, and that respect, once earned, could become more potent than fear. These truths, ingrained in his formative years, set the stage for the man he would become, a leader who could build a nation from behind bars, all while never losing the lessons taught by the quiet, unforgiving streets of his youth. By the time Larry Hoover reached his teenage years, the streets of Chicago's South Side had become both a classroom and a proving ground. What had once been the backdrop of childhood, the narrow alleyways, cracked sidewalks, and flickering streetlights, had transformed into a stage for lessons in ambition, survival, and strategy. Larry had grown observant, perceptive, and increasingly aware of the subtle dynamics that governed his neighborhood. He understood, almost instinctively, that respect was earned not just through fear or violence, but through intelligence, decisiveness, and an ability to navigate the complicated web of alliances and rivalries that defined gang life. His first forays into crime were not acts of reckless bravado. They were measured steps, calculated experiments in influence and control. Small hustles, running errands for older gang members, delivering messages, occasionally trading goods, allowed him to test his instincts, learn from errors, and observe the consequences of decisions in real time. Each experience sharpened his understanding of human behavior, the delicate balance of trust, and the unspoken rules that structured the streets. Larry was learning more than just how to survive, he was learning how to operate, to build networks, and to wield influence in ways that few of his peers could comprehend. Even as a young man, his charisma was evident. People listened when he spoke, not because they feared him initially, but because there was a calm authority in his tone, a clarity in his thought, and a subtle intelligence in the way he carried himself. Others were drawn to him, curious about his mind and impressed by his ability to remain composed in situations that would have unsettled most adolescents. It was a quiet magnetism, a command that worked as effectively as any show of force. Those who became his allies often did so out of respect and fascination rather than obligation, and this early cultivation of loyalty would become a defining feature of his leadership style in the years to come. Yet the streets were unforgiving, and mistakes could be fatal. Larry learned early that ambition without caution was a liability. He observed peers make errors in judgment, trusting the wrong person, acting impulsively, or underestimating the consequences of their actions, and internalized these lessons as personal warnings. He became methodical, weighing risks, anticipating outcomes, and calculating responses. This foresight, rare among teenagers immersed in the chaotic environment of the South Side, allowed him not only to survive but to begin carving out a reputation as someone who was reliable, cunning, and capable of long-term thinking. Violence was an unavoidable part of life, but Larry approached it as a tool rather than a default. He understood when force was necessary, when intimidation could accomplish more than action, and when patience could yield results far greater than impulsive retaliation. These early calculations were not merely about personal safety, they were exercises in leadership, discipline, and the application of strategy in real-world conditions. Even small conflicts were opportunities to test his ability to influence outcomes, to observe human reactions, and to strengthen his emerging authority among peers and potential rivals. Education outside the streets also played a subtle role. While formal schooling could not shield him from the realities of his environment, it provided moments of reflection, skill building, and understanding of the wider world. Reading, observation, and casual learning became part of the toolkit that Larry combined with his street smarts. He realized early that intellect could extend influence in ways that force alone could not, and that careful planning could multiply the effects of every action taken. This blending of academic insight and practical experience began to shape a uniquely effective approach to leadership and strategy. By mid-adolescence, Hoover's presence in the neighborhood was quietly growing. He was no longer just another boy on the streets, he was a figure who commanded attention, curiosity, and in some cases, deference. Older gang members began to notice his abilities, not for loud displays of bravado, but for the subtler qualities that marked a natural strategist: patience, observation, loyalty to trusted allies, and the ability to anticipate moves before they occurred. This growing recognition laid the groundwork for his eventual leadership, as those around him began to see him as someone capable of organizing, directing, and protecting a larger vision than mere survival or petty street disputes. The teenage years also brought the first challenges to his growing influence. Rival youths and other small gangs tested him, either through confrontation or through attempts to undermine his emerging reputation. Larry learned that conflict could be an opportunity. Each challenge was met not just with instinct, but with thoughtfulness, analyzing the motivations of others, calculating the costs and benefits of confrontation, and choosing responses that reinforced his authority while minimizing unnecessary risk. These experiences honed both his tactical mind and his ability to maintain calm under pressure, a hallmark of the leader he would become. By combining observation, calculated action, and the cultivation of loyalty, Larry began to assemble a network of allies, friends, and followers who recognized his potential. It was a subtle and gradual accumulation of influence, carried out not through loud proclamations but through earned respect. He learned that true power did not require dominance at every turn, but the ability to inspire trust, command loyalty, and create order amid chaos. These early lessons would later underpin the structure and discipline of the organization he would build, both on the streets and from within prison walls. Even in the midst of his teenage environment, a world of poverty, risk, and occasional violence, Larry maintained an unusual clarity of purpose. He understood that the small hustles, the minor confrontations, and the alliances he was forming were not ends in themselves, but stepping stones towards something larger. Each experience was both education and strategy, a building block in the foundation of a future empire. While others his age were focused on immediate survival or fleeting reputation, Larry's mind was already operating on a longer timeline, envisioning influence, structure, and sustainability in ways that few could imagine. By the time he reached the threshold of adulthood, the transformation was evident. Larry Hoover was no longer merely a participant in the streets of the South Side, he had become an emerging architect of influence, a young man whose combination of intelligence, observation, and strategic patience set him apart. His early crimes, minor though they may have seemed at the time, were the building blocks of his understanding of power, loyalty, and human nature. Every choice he made, every risk calculated, every alliance formed, was part of a quiet accumulation of authority that would eventually evolve into a structure, a network, and a reputation that extended far beyond the streets where it began. In those teenage years, Chicago's South Side taught him lessons that could not be found in any classroom: the subtlety of power, the importance of foresight, and the necessity of patience. Larry Hoover's early ventures into crime were less about rebellion or recklessness than about preparation. They were a training ground for leadership, a way to understand human behavior, and a method to develop the discipline that would one day allow him to orchestrate an empire from both the streets and the confines of prison. These years, filled with both ordinary adolescent experiences and extraordinary observations, were quietly laying the groundwork for a life that would become legendary, complex, and far-reaching. As Larry Hoover edged closer to adulthood, his influence began to solidify, not as a fleeting reputation but as the foundation of a structured organization. The street gangs of Chicago were chaotic, fragmented, and often driven by impulse or short-term gain. Hoover, however, approached the world differently. He saw beyond immediate survival. He saw patterns, hierarchies, and the potential to create something far more enduring. It was in this space of observation and calculation that the early framework of what would become the Hoover crew began to take shape. The gang was not simply a group of friends or neighborhood peers, it was an idea, a system, and a network designed to command respect, maintain order, and exert influence. The formation of the Hoover crew was gradual and deliberate. Hoover selected his allies carefully, seeking individuals who demonstrated loyalty, intelligence, and a willingness to follow guidance. It was not enough that they were tough or fearless, they had to be reliable, disciplined, and capable of operating within the rules he would establish. He began to instill a sense of hierarchy and responsibility, assigning roles and responsibilities that mirrored, in miniature, the structure of larger organizations. In doing so, he transformed what might have been a typical street gang into a disciplined collective capable of coordinated action. Even in these early stages, Hoover understood that perception was as important as power itself. The gang needed to be seen as organized, capable, and unyielding, both by allies and by rivals. This meant more than just physical presence, it meant cultivating a reputation for intelligence, strategic thinking, and the ability to navigate conflicts with precision. Street corners and neighborhood corners became arenas for influence, where Hoover's carefully orchestrated actions communicated authority without unnecessary violence. Each success, each maneuver, subtly reinforced his leadership and cemented loyalty among his followers. One of the most important aspects of forming the Hoover crew was establishing codes of loyalty and conduct. Members were taught to respect the chain of command, to protect one another, and to handle disputes with a balance of firmness and discretion. These principles were not merely theoretical, they were enforced through careful observation and accountability. Trust became the most valuable currency within the crew, and Hoover's ability to command it through a combination of respect, insight, and occasional firmness set the tone for the organization. This emphasis on loyalty and structure would later become one of the defining characteristics that allowed his influence to persist even when he was confined to prison. Territorial control was another key focus. Unlike other gangs that fought primarily for reputation or immediate profit, Hoover approached territory strategically, understanding both the economic and symbolic significance of controlled spaces. Neighborhoods, street corners, and key intersections were not just physical locations, they were points of influence, channels for information, and assets in the broader network he was constructing. Hoover's ability to map and manage these spaces gave the crew an edge over rivals, allowing them to consolidate power efficiently and minimize unnecessary conflict. The early operations of the Hoover crew extended beyond simple street-level hustles. Larry encouraged diversification, understanding that influence could be leveraged in multiple ways. Financial schemes, protection networks, and strategic alliances with other local groups became part of the operational blueprint. These activities were carefully coordinated, with Hoover's oversight ensuring that each member knew their role and understood the broader objectives. In this way, the crew functioned not as a chaotic collective but as a cohesive system, capable of executing complex operations while maintaining loyalty and order. Even as the gang grew in size and capability, Hoover maintained an emphasis on strategic patience. He avoided impulsive confrontations that could destabilize the crew or draw unnecessary attention from law enforcement. Conflicts were approached as opportunities to strengthen authority, negotiate outcomes, and expand influence rather than simply win battles. This measured approach distinguished the Hoover crew from many of their contemporaries, giving them a reputation for both discipline and cunning. Rivals often underestimated the crew's sophistication, interpreting their calm demeanor as weakness rather than a carefully maintained facade of strategic control. The social fabric of the neighborhoods in which the Hoover crew operated was also significant. Hoover recognized that influence extended beyond the gang itself. He cultivated relationships with local residents, community leaders, and even businesses, understanding that alliances outside the immediate crew could reinforce stability, provide intelligence, and enhance the group's reputation. These early interactions laid the groundwork for a more complex network that extended into areas of social and economic influence, a precursor to the expansive reach that Hoover would later achieve from behind bars. Despite the growing power of the crew, Hoover remained grounded in the lessons of his youth. Observation, patience, and strategic thinking remained central to his leadership style. He continued to watch human behavior closely, analyzing rival movements, ally intentions, and the subtle shifts in neighborhood dynamics. This combination of structured organization and acute awareness of human nature allowed the Hoover crew to navigate the turbulent streets of Chicago with a level of foresight and control that few other gangs possessed. Within the crew, loyalty was reinforced not only through guidance and mentorship but also through a sense of purpose. Members were made to feel that they were part of something larger than themselves, a system that could protect them, empower them, and provide opportunities that ordinary street life could not. This sense of belonging was both practical and psychological, forging bonds that went beyond fear or convenience. Hoover understood that enduring power was built not only through control but through commitment, and he cultivated that commitment meticulously. The early rise of the Hoover crew was also marked by careful attention to reputation management. Hoover understood that influence was not merely about immediate action but about perception. Allies, rivals, and even law enforcement were constantly observing, interpreting, and reacting to cues. Every move made by the crew was designed to project competence, control, and authority. This attention to image, combined with strategic action, allowed Hoover to expand his network while maintaining stability and minimizing internal discord. By the end of these formative years, the Hoover crew had evolved from a loosely connected group of adolescents into a disciplined organization with clear structure, loyalty, and strategic purpose. Hoover's vision was taking shape, not just in the operations of the crew but in the mindset of its members and the way the surrounding neighborhoods perceived them. What began as a small collection of friends had become a network capable of influence, protection, and coordination. Larry Hoover had demonstrated that leadership was not merely about violence or intimidation, it was about intelligence, patience, and the ability to build systems that could endure. Even in these early stages, there were hints of the paradox that would define his later life. The same streets that nurtured his rise were full of danger, scrutiny, and unpredictability. Rivals, law enforcement, and the volatile nature of urban life constantly threatened to destabilize the crew. Yet, Hoover's careful orchestration of loyalty, strategy, and perception allowed the organization to thrive amid chaos. This delicate balance between order and danger, planning and adaptability, would become the hallmark of his leadership and a precursor to the empire he would eventually establish. In the quiet nights of Chicago's South Side, amid the flickering streetlights and echoing distant sounds, the Hoover crew operated as a microcosm of what Larry Hoover envisioned, a disciplined, loyal, and strategic network capable of enduring challenges, seizing opportunities, and expanding influence. It was a small but potent beginning, one that would evolve into a legacy extending far beyond the confines of the neighborhoods that had shaped it. The foundation was laid, the lessons absorbed, and the first threads of a larger empire were quietly being woven, invisible to many but profoundly consequential to the world Larry was preparing to influence. As Larry Hoover transitioned from his teenage years into early adulthood, the quiet authority he had cultivated began to blossom into unmistakable leadership. The South Side of Chicago, with all its chaos and unpredictability, was a proving ground where only those who combined intelligence, patience, and charisma could rise above the fray. Larry had already learned that survival alone was insufficient. To leave a lasting mark, one had to influence, organize, and envision possibilities beyond immediate circumstances. He approached this challenge with a measured focus, observing not just the streets themselves but the people who walked them, their desires, fears, alliances, and weaknesses. In doing so, he began to emerge as a figure who commanded attention without ever needing to assert dominance through sheer force. His first major steps into leadership were subtle, almost imperceptible to the casual observer. Hoover had the rare ability to blend into his environment while simultaneously shaping it. Meetings that appeared casual to outsiders were often strategic gatherings where alliances were formed, hierarchies reinforced, and loyalties tested. Conflicts were analyzed and addressed not impulsively, but with foresight, ensuring that every decision reinforced his growing authority. Those who followed him did so because they recognized a mind that thought several steps ahead, someone capable of navigating the treacherous landscape of the streets with both caution and vision. By this stage, the structure of his organization was becoming more defined. Roles and responsibilities were assigned with careful consideration, reflecting both the individual strengths of his allies and the broader goals of the network. Trust, Hoover knew, was fragile and had to be earned continuously. He cultivated an environment where loyalty was rewarded, intelligence was respected, and discipline was paramount. The gang was no longer just a collection of individuals, it was a cohesive system capable of coordinated action. Each member understood their place, their duties, and the expectations placed upon them. Hoover's influence was not built on fear alone, it was built on respect, vision, and the demonstration that following his lead would lead to both safety and opportunity. The streets themselves became a canvas upon which Hoover painted his strategy. He observed rival gangs with meticulous attention, noting patterns of behavior, tendencies toward aggression, and weaknesses in their structures. Conflicts were not approached blindly, they were opportunities to assert authority, consolidate power, and expand influence. Hoover learned to measure risk against reward, choosing his battles carefully while maintaining the perception of strength and control. The calm precision with which he operated often confused rivals, who misinterpreted his measured approach as hesitation or weakness, when in fact it was a calculated demonstration of intelligence and strategy. Financial acumen was another facet of Hoover's rise. He understood that influence required resources, and resources required organization. The operations he oversaw were diversified, extending beyond simple street-level hustles to more complex networks of trade, protection, and revenue generation. Each initiative was carefully planned, with oversight and accountability embedded in the system. Larry's mind worked like a strategist's chessboard, each move calculated to build both immediate and long-term advantages. The success of these operations reinforced his credibility, attracting new allies and cementing loyalty among existing members. Beyond the tactical and financial aspects, Hoover's rise was also defined by his ability to inspire commitment. He understood that leadership was not merely about issuing orders, it was about creating a sense of purpose, identity, and belonging. Members of the crew were made to feel part of something larger than themselves, a system that could protect, empower, and elevate them. This sense of shared mission fostered loyalty that went deeper than fear, binding individuals together in a network whose strength was amplified by mutual trust and respect. Hoover's charisma was quiet but potent. He commanded attention not through spectacle but through the confidence and clarity of his vision. At the same time, Hoover remained acutely aware of the fragility of power. The streets were unpredictable, alliances were fluid, and law enforcement scrutiny loomed constantly. Every decision required careful consideration, balancing immediate gain against potential long-term consequences. He developed an ability to anticipate both opportunities and threats, using observation and insight to guide the crew's actions. This foresight became a hallmark of his leadership style, distinguishing him from contemporaries who relied primarily on impulsive aggression or intimidation. Hoover's authority was measured, deliberate, and durable precisely because it was grounded in understanding rather than fear alone. Conflict with rivals became inevitable as Hoover's influence grew. Yet even in confrontation, his approach remained strategic. He understood that raw violence without purpose could destabilize the network he had worked to build. Instead, he employed negotiation, alliances, and selective intimidation to maintain dominance while minimizing unnecessary risk. By controlling both the outcomes and the perception of conflicts, he reinforced his reputation as a leader capable of both decisiveness and intelligence. Rivals who once underestimated him began to recognize that his calm, calculating presence was far more dangerous than any impulsive act of aggression. Community perception also played a subtle but important role in Hoover's ascent. While he was deeply enmeshed in the realities of street life, he understood the power of reputation and influence beyond his immediate crew. Allies and residents observed his actions, noting his ability to enforce order, mediate disputes, and navigate the complex social dynamics of the neighborhood. This extended network of influence provided both protection and legitimacy, reinforcing Hoover's authority and expanding his reach. The perception of a disciplined, intelligent, and strategic leader amplified the actual power he wielded, creating a feedback loop that strengthened both his crew and his personal standing. Education, mentorship, and observation continued to shape Hoover during this period. He learned from older, experienced figures in the neighborhood while also reflecting critically on his own experiences. Mistakes were absorbed as lessons, successes were studied and replicated. This iterative approach to leadership, combining observation, reflection, and action, allowed him to refine his strategies continuously. It was a methodical, almost surgical approach to influence, one that contrasted sharply with the impulsive, reactionary behavior of many contemporaries. Hoover's ability to remain calm under pressure, to anticipate the moves of others, and to act with precision established him as a leader whose authority was both respected and enduring. By the end of these formative years, Larry Hoover had transformed from a keenly observant youth into a commanding figure capable of orchestrating complex networks of influence and loyalty. The crew he led was no longer a loosely connected gang, it was a disciplined organization, structured, strategic, and poised for expansion. His rise was not marked by reckless bravado or chaotic violence, but by intelligence, patience, and an unwavering focus on both immediate and long-term objectives. Hoover had begun to embody the paradox that would define his life, a man who thrived in chaos not by surrendering to it, but by understanding, predicting, and shaping it to his will. Even in the darkest corners of Chicago's South Side, amid the flickering streetlights, distant sirens, and constant hum of life, Hoover's presence was quietly felt. Every decision, every alliance, every action was part of a deliberate pattern, a foundation being laid for a legacy that would extend far beyond the streets he walked. In those years of careful leadership, strategic thinking, and patient observation, Larry Hoover began to define the path that would eventually lead him to not only control an empire on the streets but to orchestrate influence that could survive even behind prison walls. The transformation from street-smart youth to disciplined leader was complete, and the stage was set for the next phase of his rise, a phase that would test his intellect, resilience, and ability to command respect on a scale few could imagine. As Larry Hoover's reputation grew, so too did the scope of his ambitions. The early success of the Hoover crew had demonstrated that organization, loyalty, and strategic thinking could yield influence far beyond what brute force alone could achieve. Yet, Hoover was not content with controlling only small corners of the South Side. He began to envision a network that could extend across neighborhoods, consolidating power, resources, and alliances in ways that rival gangs could scarcely imagine. This was a shift from immediate survival to deliberate empire building, a vision that required foresight, patience, and an uncanny understanding of human nature. The expansion of the crew demanded more than just numbers, it required structure, discipline, and trust. Hoover meticulously evaluated potential allies, choosing individuals not for their bravado but for their reliability, intelligence, and capacity to operate within the rules he was beginning to formalize. He established clear roles within the organization, assigning responsibilities that maximized each member's strengths while reinforcing a hierarchy that could maintain order even in his absence. This early emphasis on operational structure was unusual for street gangs at the time, many of which relied primarily on reputation and fear. Hoover, however, recognized that enduring influence required more than raw power, it required the creation of a system capable of sustaining itself. Territory became both a practical and symbolic element of the crew's growing influence. Unlike some contemporaries who treated neighborhoods merely as areas to be exploited for quick profit, Hoover approached territory strategically. Control over key blocks and intersections was vital not only for economic operations but also for projecting authority and establishing a recognizable presence. Every street corner, every local business, every potential ally or rival became part of a mental map that Hoover maintained with precision. This awareness allowed him to anticipate conflicts, negotiate alliances, and expand influence without unnecessary confrontation, reinforcing the perception of an organized, omnipresent network. Financial operations also grew more sophisticated during this period. While early hustles had provided foundational experience, Hoover recognized that long-term influence depended on resources. He diversified the crew's activities, incorporating ventures that generated steady income, facilitated leverage over allies and rivals, and provided the means to reward loyalty. Each operation was carefully coordinated, with oversight designed to maintain discipline and accountability. Hoover's mind approached these tasks like a strategist plotting multiple moves in advance, anticipating potential disruptions and preparing contingencies. In this way, the crew functioned as a disciplined, adaptable system rather than a reactive street gang. Leadership, however, was not solely about strategy or economics. Hoover understood that loyalty and commitment were central to sustaining power. He cultivated a culture of respect and shared purpose, making each member feel invested in the crew's success. This sense of belonging went beyond fear or immediate gain, it created bonds that strengthened the network and allowed him to command obedience even in complex and high-risk situations. Hoover's quiet charisma and clarity of vision made him a figure to follow, someone who could inspire confidence even amid uncertainty. Expansion was not without challenges. Rival gangs, wary of Hoover's growing influence, sought to test him, either through direct confrontation or attempts to undermine his reputation. Yet even in the face of these threats, Hoover remained calm and calculated. He treated conflict as a tool rather than a hazard, analyzing each situation to determine the optimal approach. Some rivalries were resolved through negotiation or strategic alliances, while others required carefully measured displays of strength. Every move reinforced his authority, demonstrated his intelligence, and sent a clear message that the Hoover crew operated with discipline and foresight, not impulsive aggression. Hoover's approach to alliances was equally strategic. He understood that power was amplified by relationships, both within the immediate crew and beyond. Partnerships with other local groups were forged carefully, based on mutual benefit, respect, and trust. These alliances expanded the crew's operational reach, strengthened its influence, and added layers of security. By positioning himself as a reliable and strategic partner, Hoover ensured that his network could grow while minimizing exposure to unnecessary risk. He recognized that strength was as much about perception and partnership as it was about direct control. Even amid growth and increasing visibility, Hoover maintained an acute awareness of the fragile nature of power. Law enforcement, rival gangs, and the inherent volatility of street life were constant reminders that influence could be fleeting. To counter this, he emphasized discipline within the crew, ensuring that actions were deliberate, roles were respected, and loyalty was continuously reinforced. Observation, patience, and foresight remained central to his leadership style, allowing the organization to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining cohesion and authority. At the same time, Hoover continued to study human behavior with a methodical intensity. Every interaction, confrontation, and negotiation provided insight into motivations, fears, and ambitions. He learned to anticipate reactions, leverage weaknesses, and inspire loyalty, transforming social and psychological understanding into practical tools for influence. This combination of strategic thinking and psychological acuity distinguished Hoover from many of his contemporaries, giving him an edge in both conflict and diplomacy. Community perception remained a vital component of Hoover's strategy. He understood that influence was reinforced not only by the crew's internal discipline but also by how neighbors, allies, and rivals perceived their actions. By maintaining a balance of respect, fear, and presence, Hoover cultivated an image that extended beyond the crew itself. Neighborhood residents saw the crew as organized, capable, and controlled, an image that deterred rivals and attracted potential allies. Every action, every calculated response, served to reinforce this perception, amplifying the crew's influence and establishing a foundation for future growth. By the time Hoover reached his mid-20s, the early version of his empire was beginning to take tangible shape. The crew operated with structure, discipline, and a clear hierarchy. Financial and territorial operations were diversified and coordinated, alliances were carefully cultivated, and loyalty was reinforced through shared purpose and consistent leadership. Hoover's reputation as a strategic, intelligent, and patient leader was firmly established, earning him respect both among his allies and from those who watched from a distance. This period also highlighted the duality that would define Hoover's legacy, a man thriving in an environment of chaos not by surrendering to it, but by understanding, predicting, and shaping it. He balanced ambition with patience, strategy with discipline, and vision with pragmatism. Each decision, each alliance, and each operation was a calculated step toward consolidating influence and expanding control, laying the groundwork for an organization that would endure challenges and outlast individual members. Even amid the unpredictable rhythms of Chicago's South Side, the flickering streetlights, the distant sirens, the shifting allegiances, Larry Hoover's presence was quietly formidable. His mind worked steadily behind the scenes, weaving networks of loyalty, influence, and power that would later define his empire. By the end of this formative period, it was clear that Hoover was no longer simply a street leader, he was a strategist, an architect of influence, and a figure whose decisions would resonate far beyond the neighborhoods that had shaped him. The foundation of a lasting legacy was being laid, and the next chapter of his life would test the strength of this foundation in ways both challenging and extraordinary. As Larry Hoover's influence grew, the inevitable attention of law enforcement and rival gangs began to intensify. By now, he was no longer just a local figure, his reputation had begun to extend beyond the immediate streets of Chicago's South Side. Stories circulated, some whispered, some openly discussed, about the disciplined operations of the Hoover crew, the intelligence with which Hoover navigated conflict, and the loyalty he commanded from those around him. To many, he was becoming more than a gang leader, he was a strategist whose presence was felt even without direct action. Yet this rising notoriety came with a new set of challenges, testing both his leadership and his ability to protect the organization he had painstakingly built. The pressure of law enforcement was a constant undercurrent. Hoover understood that visibility brought danger, and that every movement, every decision, could attract unwanted attention. Yet, he approached this threat not with panic or rash action but with calculated foresight. Surveillance, informants, and undercover investigations were part of the environment he navigated daily. He learned to anticipate police strategies, to operate discreetly, and to ensure that the crew's actions remained coordinated and insulated from exposure whenever possible. Every encounter with law enforcement was both a test and a lesson, reinforcing the importance of patience, secrecy, and strategic planning. Rival gangs, recognizing Hoover's growing influence, sought to challenge him, testing both his authority and the loyalty of his allies. These confrontations were rarely impulsive or chaotic. Instead, Hoover treated them as opportunities to assert dominance while minimizing unnecessary risk. He analyzed motivations, assessed strengths and weaknesses, and deployed the crew in ways that maximized advantage. Sometimes, intimidation was enough to dissuade potential challengers. Other times, strategic negotiation or selective confrontation was required. Through these interactions, Hoover demonstrated that leadership was not about reacting to circumstances but about shaping them. The network of alliances Hoover had cultivated proved invaluable during this period. Relationships with local leaders, business owners, and sympathetic figures in the community provided not only protection but intelligence. He learned to read subtle cues, interpret rumors, and use information strategically. These alliances allowed Hoover to stay several steps ahead of rivals, anticipate potential threats, and expand influence without unnecessary conflict. His ability to combine operational oversight with social intelligence distinguished him from contemporaries, reinforcing his reputation as both disciplined and calculating. Financial operations continued to grow in sophistication. The early hustles had provided experience, but now Hoover oversaw ventures that were coordinated, diversified, and strategically managed. Revenue was reinvested into the network, supporting loyalty, operational capacity, and expansion. Every operation was planned with foresight, ensuring efficiency and reducing exposure to risk. Hoover's ability to maintain both financial oversight and operational discipline reflected a mind attuned not only to immediate gains but to the sustainability of the organization over time. This period also emphasized Hoover's understanding of loyalty and human behavior. He recognized that respect and trust were fragile commodities, easily broken yet crucial to organizational stability. He cultivated loyalty through mentorship, rewards, and the consistent demonstration of competence. Members of the crew were made to feel valued, invested in, and part of a system larger than themselves. This psychological aspect of leadership, balancing authority with inclusion, discipline with recognition, allowed Hoover to command obedience that went beyond fear, creating bonds that would endure even under pressure. Conflict, both internal and external, tested Hoover's patience and strategic skill. Occasionally, disagreements arose within the crew, as individuals navigated their ambitions, fears, or rivalries. Hoover handled these situations with careful mediation, ensuring that disputes were resolved in ways that reinforced hierarchy, trust, and cohesion. He learned to balance firmness with empathy, understanding that a disciplined crew required not only clear rules but also a sense of fairness and shared purpose. By maintaining stability within the organization, Hoover ensured that external challenges could be met with unity rather than division. The ability to anticipate the actions of others became increasingly important. Rivals, observing Hoover's rising influence, sometimes attempted deception, manipulation, or entrapment. Hoover's careful observation, combined with his deep understanding of human nature, allowed him to detect these maneuvers and respond strategically. Rather than reacting impulsively, he used intelligence, foresight, and controlled action to neutralize threats while maintaining the crew's cohesion and reputation. This calm, analytical approach reinforced the perception that Hoover was always several steps ahead, an impression that both deterred rivals and inspired loyalty. Community perception remained a subtle but powerful tool. Hoover understood that the crew's image influenced both internal cohesion and external interactions. By maintaining an aura of organization, intelligence, and authority, he projected strength without unnecessary aggression. This perception was reinforced through consistent action, the protection of allies, and the careful handling of conflicts. Residents and outsiders alike observed the crew's discipline and strategic operations, which in turn enhanced Hoover's influence and allowed him to expand the network with minimal disruption. During this time, the principles of long-term vision became increasingly clear in Hoover's leadership. He recognized that survival alone was insufficient, influence had to be consolidated, systems had to be built, and structures had to endure. Every action, every decision, every alliance was measured against this long-term perspective. Hoover's capacity for strategic foresight allowed him to manage short-term challenges while simultaneously advancing toward the broader objectives of power, control, and loyalty. It was a delicate balancing act, but one he navigated with precision and calm authority. Even as scrutiny from law enforcement intensified and rival gangs tested the crew's boundaries, Hoover's presence remained quietly formidable. His ability to blend observation, strategy, and leadership allowed him to maintain influence without unnecessary visibility. Every calculated decision reinforced both internal cohesion and external perception, creating a network capable of thriving amid adversity. The crew's loyalty, discipline, and efficiency became a reflection of Hoover himself, a leader who commanded respect not through spectacle, but through intelligence, foresight, and measured action. By the end of this phase, Larry Hoover had transformed from a young gang leader into a sophisticated strategist, capable of managing complex networks of loyalty, influence, and power. His operations were diversified, his alliances were strong, and his reputation as an intelligent, patient, and capable leader was firmly established. He had learned to navigate both the streets and the scrutiny of law enforcement, balancing immediate survival with long-term vision. The foundations of his empire were solidifying, and the stage was set for further expansion, challenges, and opportunities that would test his intellect, resilience, and ability to command influence across a broader landscape. By the time Larry Hoover entered his late 20s, his reputation had solidified not only on the streets of Chicago but within a broader network that extended across neighborhoods and local organizations. The Hoover crew was no longer a small street gang, it had evolved into a disciplined and structured collective with a clear hierarchy, a system of loyalty, and a set of operational principles designed to maintain cohesion and influence. Hoover himself had become a figure whose presence commanded attention, respect, and, at times, quiet fear. Yet, what distinguished him from others in the underworld was not merely the reach of his organization, but the methodical, almost academic way in which he understood and applied power. At this stage, expansion was both a necessity and an opportunity. The streets of Chicago were crowded with competing interests, each vying for control of territory, resources, and influence. Hoover approached these dynamics with a strategic mindset, understanding that conflicts could be leveraged as tools to consolidate power rather than simply obstacles to overcome. Rival gangs were carefully assessed, with strengths, weaknesses, and patterns of behavior meticulously mapped. Decisions about engagement, alliance, or avoidance were never impulsive, each was informed by observation, experience, and foresight. In this way, Hoover was able to grow his influence while minimizing unnecessary risk, projecting strength without attracting unwanted attention. The crew itself had grown in sophistication. Roles were clearly defined, responsibilities delegated, and accountability maintained. Each member understood not only their duties but the broader vision of the organization. This clarity of structure allowed the Hoover crew to operate with efficiency, discipline, and adaptability, qualities rare among street organizations of the time. Hoover's leadership was evident not through coercion alone but through the cultivation of respect, trust, and a shared sense of purpose. Members were not simply followers, they were participants in a system designed to succeed collectively, with each individual's loyalty and skill contributing to the strength of the whole. Territorial control remained a central concern. Hoover recognized that influence was reinforced not only through internal organization but through the perception of dominance in key neighborhoods. Certain streets, intersections, and areas became carefully managed zones, controlled both physically and symbolically. This management was not brute force, it was strategy. Hoover understood the importance of creating an aura of omnipresence, where the crew's reach seemed wider than it was and its authority more pervasive than mere numbers could convey. The result was a network that deterred rivals, attracted allies, and maintained order within its sphere of influence. Financial operations also matured during this period. The crew diversified its revenue streams, balancing high-risk ventures with more stable sources of income. Each operation was planned with oversight and coordination, ensuring that profits were maximized while exposure to risk was minimized. Hoover's ability to integrate financial acumen with strategic planning reinforced the organization's sustainability and provided the resources necessary to reward loyalty, maintain discipline, and expand influence. Money was not merely a tool for wealth, it was a means of consolidating power and maintaining control. Loyalty remained the cornerstone of Hoover's leadership. He recognized that influence was fragile and could be undermined by disloyalty, impulsiveness, or internal strife. To address this, he cultivated a culture of trust, mentorship, and mutual investment. Members of the crew were valued not just for their abilities but for their commitment to the system Hoover had constructed. He reinforced loyalty through recognition, guidance, and strategic rewards, ensuring that the bonds within the organization were stronger than any external threat. This psychological aspect of leadership, balancing authority with inclusion, discipline with recognition, was critical to the crew's enduring cohesion. Even as the organization thrived, Hoover was acutely aware of the risks posed by law enforcement and rival factions. Each interaction, each expansion, and each decision was evaluated for potential exposure or vulnerability. Hoover's approach was preventative rather than reactive. Surveillance, careful communication, and strategic discretion allowed the crew to operate effectively while minimizing the likelihood of disruption. His awareness of external threats, combined with internal discipline, created a system that was resilient, adaptive, and capable of weathering challenges that might have destabilized lesser organizations. Community perception continued to be a subtle yet powerful tool. Hoover understood that influence extended beyond the immediate members of the crew. Neighborhood residents, local businesses, and peripheral figures observed the crew's actions and assessed its strength. By maintaining a disciplined, controlled, and strategic presence, Hoover ensured that the crew was perceived as organized, intelligent, and capable. This perception enhanced influence, attracted potential allies, and discouraged unnecessary conflict. In effect, the crew's reputation became a force multiplier, allowing Hoover to extend his reach without exposing the organization to additional risk. The challenges of leadership were not limited to external threats. Hoover also had to manage internal dynamics, mediating disputes, resolving conflicts, and ensuring that ambition within the crew did not destabilize the organization. He employed a combination of mentorship, strategic oversight, and disciplined enforcement of rules to maintain cohesion. Members learned that loyalty was expected but also rewarded, that rules were enforced but fairness was upheld, and that each individual's contribution was recognized within the broader system. This balance of discipline and empathy strengthened the crew and reinforced Hoover's authority. As the organization expanded, so too did Hoover's vision. He began to consider long-term sustainability, thinking beyond immediate profits and territorial control. Plans were developed for maintaining influence even if he were temporarily removed from direct leadership. Structures were embedded to ensure continuity, loyalty, and operational discipline regardless of circumstance. This foresight was unusual in the street landscape, where short-term thinking often dominated. Hoover's ability to combine strategic planning, financial oversight, and psychological understanding of loyalty allowed him to create an organization capable of enduring challenges and adapting to new circumstances. By the end of this period, Larry Hoover had established himself as a formidable force in Chicago. His crew was disciplined, structured, and strategically positioned to exert influence across neighborhoods and networks. Rival gangs were cautious, law enforcement awareness was growing, and allies trusted in his vision and guidance. Hoover had become more than a street leader, he was a strategist, a visionary, and a figure whose intelligence, patience, and foresight distinguished him from those around him. His empire was no longer confined to physical territory, it extended into perception, loyalty, and influence, establishing a foundation that would endure even the most challenging trials of his life. In the quiet of Chicago nights, amid flickering streetlights and distant echoes of urban life, Hoover's presence was palpable. Every decision, every alliance, and every operation reflected a mind attuned to both immediate circumstances and long-term objectives. The organization he built was disciplined, adaptable, and resilient, capable of thriving amid chaos while projecting calm authority. Larry Hoover had reached a stage where his influence was undeniable, his leadership secure, and his vision of a lasting network well underway. The next chapter would test the strength of this foundation, as challenges from rivals, the law, and the unpredictability of life on the streets demanded both intellect and resilience on an unprecedented scale. As Larry Hoover's influence extended across Chicago's South Side, the inevitable attention of law enforcement became increasingly pronounced. His reputation as a disciplined, strategic, and intelligent leader could not go unnoticed. Yet Hoover had learned long ago that visibility was both a tool and a threat. He operated with a delicate balance, being influential enough to command loyalty and respect, yet discreet enough to avoid drawing unwanted scrutiny. It was a skill honed over years of observation, trial, and careful adaptation, a skill that allowed him to maintain control in an environment where missteps could prove fatal. Hoover's early encounters with law enforcement were instructive. He quickly realized that evasion was insufficient. He needed to understand the mindset, methods, and motivations of those who sought to contain him. Surveillance, informants, and legal challenges were all part of the landscape he navigated daily. By studying patterns of investigation and enforcement, he learned to anticipate pressure points, adjust operations accordingly, and protect both himself and his organization. This awareness reinforced his broader approach to leadership. Control was not only about direct influence but also about understanding and mitigating risk from every direction. Conflict with rival gangs escalated during this period, testing Hoover's strategic abilities in unprecedented ways. As his reputation grew, so too did the ambitions of others who sought to challenge his authority. Encounters that might have been straightforward in earlier years now required careful calculation. Hoover's approach combined observation, patience, and tactical action. He assessed rival strengths, monitored shifting alliances, and anticipated potential moves before committing to any response. Some conflicts were resolved through negotiation and strategic alliances, others through carefully measured displays of strength. Each decision reinforced his authority and cemented his reputation as a leader whose intelligence and foresight surpassed brute force alone. Territorial control remained central to the organization's expansion, yet it was approached with subtlety and strategy. Certain streets, intersections, and neighborhoods were carefully managed, not simply as sites of operations but as symbols of influence. Hoover understood that control was as much about perception as it was about physical presence. A rival observing the Hoover crew would sense an organization operating with precision, discipline, and foresight, an impression that often deterred aggression and facilitated alliances. These psychological dimensions of leadership became increasingly important as Hoover's network extended into areas where direct enforcement alone was insufficient. Financial sophistication continued to define the crew's operations. By this stage, the organization had moved beyond basic hustles and small-scale ventures. Hoover oversaw diverse revenue streams, ensuring that resources were strategically allocated to reinforce loyalty, support operational needs, and fund expansion. Each initiative was monitored for efficiency, risk, and long-term sustainability. Money was not merely profit, it was influence, leverage, and a means of consolidating power. This approach underscored Hoover's ability to integrate financial strategy with organizational discipline, creating a system capable of enduring both internal and external challenges. Loyalty within the crew remained the cornerstone of Hoover's authority. He cultivated relationships that combined mentorship, guidance, and accountability. Members were taught that their commitment was valuable not only to themselves but to the collective strength of the organization. Recognition and rewards reinforced their sense of purpose, while clear expectations and consistent discipline maintained cohesion. Hoover's leadership was defined by this balance: firmness tempered with fairness, authority combined with inclusion, and strategic oversight guided by insight into human behavior. The result was a network bonded not merely by fear but by shared purpose and trust. Community perception played a subtle yet vital role during this period. Hoover understood that influence extended beyond the crew itself. Neighborhood residents, business owners, and peripheral allies observed the organization's actions, assessing its capability, discipline, and authority. By cultivating an image of order, intelligence, and strategic presence, Hoover reinforced both internal loyalty and external respect. This perception became a force multiplier, allowing the crew to expand influence while minimizing direct conflict and risk exposure. The streets themselves became a canvas upon which Hoover projected both authority and subtle restraint, a combination that few rivals could match. The complexity of internal management grew as the crew expanded. Ambition, personal grievances, and differing temperaments required Hoover to exercise both patience and decisiveness. Mediation of disputes, reinforcement of rules, and strategic allocation of responsibilities became essential to maintaining organizational stability. Hoover's methodical approach ensured that internal challenges did not compromise the cohesion or effectiveness of the crew. By fostering both accountability and loyalty, he created an environment where members could operate confidently, knowing that the structure supporting them was reliable, fair, and strategic. Strategic foresight was perhaps Hoover's greatest asset during this period. He anticipated not only immediate threats but potential future challenges, planning contingencies and embedding resilience within the organization. Whether managing conflicts, navigating law enforcement scrutiny, or expanding operations, Hoover relied on observation, analysis, and calculated decision-making. His leadership exemplified the principle that enduring influence requires preparation, patience, and the ability to respond with intelligence rather than impulse. This foresight distinguished Hoover from many contemporaries who relied primarily on aggression or intimidation, providing him with a lasting edge in both power and respect. By the end of this period, Larry Hoover had solidified his position as a sophisticated strategist, capable of managing complex networks of influence across the urban landscape. The crew was disciplined, loyal, and coordinated, operating efficiently while projecting both strength and strategic intelligence. Rival gangs were cautious, law enforcement increasingly attentive, and the broader community recognized the calculated authority of Hoover's organization. He had become more than a gang leader, he was a tactician, a visionary, and a figure whose decisions and foresight would shape not only his own destiny but the structure and influence of an organization capable of enduring even the harshest challenges. Amid the quiet of Chicago nights, the distant hum of traffic, the flickering streetlights, and the subtle murmur of life, Hoover's presence was felt in every measured decision, every alliance, and every operation. His empire was no longer a simple gang, it was a disciplined, resilient network, designed to endure, adapt, and expand. This period of consolidation and refinement laid the groundwork for the next stage of Hoover's journey, a stage that would test his strategic genius, his patience, and his ability to command influence on a scale few could imagine. The foundation was secure, the crew loyal, and the vision clear. The empire Hoover had begun to build was poised to grow, even amid the unpredictable realities of the streets he called home. By the time Larry Hoover had reached his early 30s, the network he had meticulously built was beginning to operate like a small, self-sustaining ecosystem. The Hoover crew was no longer simply a street organization, it had become a disciplined structure capable of executing complex operations with precision, managing loyalty and influence across multiple neighborhoods, and projecting authority both internally and externally. Hoover's leadership had evolved into a combination of strategic foresight, psychological understanding, and practical governance, a rare combination in an environment where impulsive decisions often dictated the fates of those who attempted to rise above chaos. At this stage, Hoover's influence extended well beyond mere territorial control. Neighborhoods were mapped not just for operational convenience but for their potential to enhance the crew's power and reputation. Certain intersections, street blocks, and local businesses became nodes of influence, carefully monitored and managed. Hoover understood that authority was as much about perception as it was about physical presence. By controlling both space and image, he created an aura of omnipresence, a sense that the crew's influence extended far beyond what could be directly observed. Rival gangs, even those that might have challenged him, began to respect the precision and planning with which Hoover approached both expansion and enforcement. Financial sophistication continued to define the organization's evolution. Operations had grown beyond simple hustles into diversified ventures, blending legitimate-seeming businesses with underground economies. Money flowed strategically through these channels, reinforcing loyalty, funding operations, and providing leverage over allies and rivals alike. Each initiative was carefully planned, monitored, and executed to ensure maximum efficiency and minimal exposure to risk. For Hoover, finances were not simply a matter of profit, they were an instrument of influence, a means to maintain control, and a foundation for long-term sustainability. The internal dynamics of the crew were equally important. Hoover recognized that loyalty and discipline were fragile and needed continuous cultivation. Mentorship, rewards, and accountability were integrated into the organizational culture. Members were made to feel valued, understood, and invested in a collective mission that extended beyond personal gain. Hoover's leadership style balanced authority with inclusion, ensuring that individuals respected the rules while also understanding the larger purpose behind them. This approach fostered bonds that were stronger than fear alone, creating a resilient network capable of withstanding both internal disputes and external pressures. Conflict remained a constant test of Hoover's abilities. Rival gangs, eager to challenge the growing influence of the Hoover crew, attempted both direct confrontations and more subtle forms of sabotage. Hoover approached these situations with careful analysis. Strengths and weaknesses were assessed, potential outcomes were anticipated, and responses were calibrated to achieve the greatest strategic advantage with the least unnecessary risk. Negotiation, alliance formation, and selective shows of strength were all tools in his arsenal. Through these measured actions, Hoover reinforced the perception of control, intelligence, and authority, ensuring that rivals understood both his capabilities and the consequences of miscalculation. The strategic management of relationships was another hallmark of Hoover's leadership during this period. Alliances with other crews, local community leaders, and peripheral figures were carefully maintained and leveraged. Hoover understood that influence could be multiplied through networks of trust, reciprocity, and shared interest. These connections not only extended the reach of the crew but also provided crucial intelligence, mitigating the risks posed by law enforcement or rival factions. By combining operational acumen with social intelligence, Hoover created a web of influence that extended well beyond the immediate crew. Observation and foresight continued to define Hoover's approach. He studied human behavior with meticulous attention, learning to anticipate reactions, motivations, and vulnerabilities. Every encounter, every negotiation, and every decision became an opportunity to gather insight, refine strategy, and reinforce his authority. This psychological acuity, combined with operational and financial discipline, created a unique leadership profile, one capable of navigating the unpredictable dynamics of street life while maintaining long-term strategic focus. Community perception remained a subtle but potent tool. Hoover understood that the organization's influence was enhanced by how it was seen as much as by what it accomplished. A reputation for discipline, intelligence, and foresight extended the crew's reach without necessitating constant physical enforcement. Neighborhood residents, business owners, and potential allies observed these dynamics and responded accordingly, often reinforcing the crew's authority simply through recognition and respect. Hoover's careful orchestration of both action and perception magnified the crew's influence, creating a foundation for enduring power. The period also highlighted the paradox that would define much of Hoover's life, his ability to thrive in chaos not by reacting impulsively but by shaping and anticipating it. While the environment around him remained unpredictable, his careful planning, disciplined approach, and strategic vision allowed the organization to maintain stability and expand influence. Conflict, law enforcement attention, and the volatility of street life became variables to be managed rather than threats to be feared. Hoover's calm and measured approach provided both resilience and credibility, reinforcing his position as a leader whose authority extended beyond immediate action to enduring influence. By the end of this phase, Larry Hoover had evolved into a figure of considerable power and intellect. The Hoover crew operated with a degree of discipline, coordination, and strategic awareness unmatched by most contemporaries. The organization's financial, territorial, and social networks were robust, and the loyalty of its members was reinforced through both mentorship and strategic reward. Hoover's reputation for intelligence, foresight, and calm authority was firmly established, earning respect from allies and deterring rivals alike. He had transformed from a street-smart youth into a sophisticated leader capable of managing complex networks of influence in a challenging and unpredictable environment. Amid the quiet hum of Chicago nights, the distant sirens, the flickering streetlights, and the subtle pulse of urban life, Hoover's presence was quietly omnipresent. Every operation, every decision, and every alliance reflected a mind attuned to both immediate needs and long-term objectives. The crew had become more than a gang, it was a system of influence, loyalty, and strategic capacity. Hoover's empire, carefully constructed and meticulously maintained, was now poised to enter the next phase, one that would challenge his leadership, test his resilience, and ultimately define the enduring legacy of a man who had mastered both strategy and influence in a world where chaos reigned supreme. As Larry Hoover's organization matured, he began to focus not only on expansion and influence but also on the deeper consolidation of power. By this stage, the Hoover crew was no longer a loosely connected network of street-level operatives, it had evolved into a structured organization with multiple layers of hierarchy, clearly defined roles, and a system of accountability. Hoover understood that leadership was not merely about commanding attention, it was about creating a self-sustaining entity capable of surviving challenges, adapting to change, and enduring beyond the tenure of any single member. His approach to consolidation was methodical, deliberate, and rooted in both observation and experience. The foundation of this consolidation lay in loyalty. Hoover had long recognized that influence without loyalty was fleeting, and he dedicated significant attention to cultivating trust and commitment within the crew. Members were mentored, guided, and rewarded in ways that reinforced their investment in the organization. Loyalty was not demanded through fear alone, it was nurtured through respect, recognition, and the promise of shared success. Hoover understood that a network built on trust and mutual purpose was far more resilient than one built solely on intimidation, and he applied this philosophy consistently, ensuring that the crew remained cohesive even under external pressures. Territorial strategy became increasingly sophisticated. Hoover no longer viewed neighborhoods as mere patches of control, he saw them as interrelated nodes in a larger network of influence. Each block, corner, and intersection was evaluated for strategic value, both operationally and symbolically. Control over these spaces was exercised with precision, balancing visibility with subtlety. Rivals observing the Hoover crew would perceive a disciplined and omnipresent organization, capable of coordinated action and careful planning. This perception was as important as the reality of control itself, reinforcing Hoover's authority while deterring challenges from less organized adversaries. Financial operations continued to evolve alongside organizational structure. Hoover recognized that resources were essential not only for sustaining the crew but for reinforcing loyalty, funding expansion, and managing risk. Revenue streams were diversified, integrating high-return ventures with more stable, long-term operations. Oversight, accountability, and coordination ensured that profits were optimized while exposure to legal or operational risk was minimized. Money, in Hoover's hands, was a tool of strategy, used to maintain cohesion, reward commitment, and reinforce the perception of a disciplined and effective leadership. Internal governance was another critical component of Hoover's consolidation. As the organization grew, so did the complexity of interpersonal dynamics. Ambition, personal grievances, and differing motivations required careful management. Hoover employed a combination of mentorship, disciplined enforcement of rules, and strategic delegation to maintain cohesion. Conflicts were addressed proactively, with resolution processes designed to reinforce hierarchy and trust. This emphasis on internal stability ensured that the crew could respond to external threats with unity rather than fragmentation, further strengthening Hoover's leadership and the organization's resilience. Rival gangs presented constant tests of Hoover's strategy. By now, he was widely recognized as a formidable and intelligent leader, which naturally drew both respect and challenge. Hoover approached confrontations with calculated observation. Assessing the motivations, strengths, and weaknesses of adversaries before taking action. Negotiation, alliance formation, and selective displays of strength were carefully calibrated to achieve strategic advantage while minimizing unnecessary risk. These encounters reinforced the perception of Hoover's intelligence and foresight, establishing him as a leader capable of commanding influence without resorting to chaos or impulsive violence. Community perception continued to play a subtle but powerful role in Hoover's consolidation of power. He understood that influence extended beyond the immediate membership of the crew. Neighbors, local businesses, and peripheral allies all observed the organization's actions and made judgments about its strength and discipline. By maintaining a reputation for order, strategic intelligence, and measured authority, Hoover leveraged perception as a force multiplier, expanding influence and discouraging unnecessary conflict. The organization's disciplined presence became a stabilizing, respected, and subtly omnipresent force within the communities it touched. Strategic foresight remained central to Hoover's approach. He planned not only for immediate challenges but for potential future disruptions, embedding resilience within the organization's structure. Contingency plans, succession strategies, and operational oversight ensured that the crew could withstand unexpected pressure or change. Hoover's ability to anticipate and manage complexity allowed him to maintain stability in a volatile environment, demonstrating the rare combination of tactical intelligence, psychological insight, and practical leadership. The period also highlighted Hoover's ability to balance ambition with caution. Expansion, influence, and consolidation were pursued deliberately, with each move carefully weighed against potential consequences. Hoover recognized that unchecked ambition could destabilize even the most disciplined organization. By tempering expansion with control, foresight, and strategic calculation, he ensured that growth was sustainable and that the crew remained resilient against both internal and external threats. This careful balance became a defining characteristic of his leadership style, setting him apart from contemporaries who relied primarily on aggression or impulsive action. By the end of this stage, Larry Hoover had transformed the Hoover crew into a disciplined, resilient, and strategically structured organization. Loyalty, territorial control, financial sophistication, and community perception were carefully integrated into a system that could operate effectively even under pressure. Rival gangs were wary, law enforcement increasingly attentive, and allies trusted in the organization's stability and leadership. Hoover himself had become more than a street leader; he was a tactician, a strategist, and a figure whose foresight, patience, and intelligence allowed him to command influence with a level of authority few could challenge. Amid the quiet rhythms of Chicago nights, the distant hum of traffic, the flickering streetlights, and the subtle pulse of the community, the Hoover crew operated with precision and purpose. Every decision, alliance, and operation reflected the careful calculation and strategic vision of a leader who understood the complexities of power, influence, and human behavior. Larry Hoover's organization had evolved into a network capable of enduring challenges, adapting to change, and maintaining cohesion under pressure. The foundation had been laid for the next stage, a period of expansion, challenge, and the testing of the systems Hoover had so meticulously constructed. His leadership, patience, and insight had positioned him not merely as a gang leader, but as a figure whose legacy would be felt long after the immediate streets were no longer under his watch. As Larry Hoover's organization continued to grow, the complexity of maintaining influence and control became increasingly evident. The Hoover crew was no longer a simple street operation; it had evolved into a structured, multi-layered network, capable of both coordinated action and adaptive response. Hoover's leadership had shifted from reactive problem-solving to proactive strategy, with a focus on anticipating challenges before they arose. Every move, alliance, and decision was weighed for its immediate impact as well as its long-term consequences, reflecting a leader deeply attuned to the interplay between power, loyalty, and perception. At this stage, the organization's territorial influence had reached a point where careful management was essential. Hoover understood that power was not merely about dominance over physical spaces; it was about creating a sense of controlled presence, an invisible authority that extended beyond the streets themselves. Every block, corner, and neighborhood was monitored for operational efficiency, loyalty, and strategic value. Control was exercised subtly, often through reputation, strategic placement of trusted lieutenants, and careful observation of both allies and potential adversaries. This approach allowed the Hoover crew to maintain influence without constant confrontation, projecting authority in ways that rivals could see but seldom challenge. Financial operations had become increasingly sophisticated. The crew now balanced multiple revenue streams, combining traditional hustles with more complex and diversified ventures. Money was leveraged not only for immediate gain but for consolidating power, rewarding loyalty, and funding expansion. Each operation was meticulously coordinated, with oversight mechanisms in place to ensure accountability and efficiency. Hoover viewed resources as an extension of influence. Money was not simply wealth, but a tool to enforce structure, build networks, and sustain the organization through both prosperous and challenging times. Internal cohesion remained a central concern. As the crew expanded, the potential for internal conflict naturally increased. Ambition, personality clashes, and differing motivations had to be managed with care. Hoover's approach combined mentorship, strategic delegation, and disciplined enforcement of rules. Conflicts were addressed methodically, ensuring that resolutions reinforced hierarchy, trust, and shared purpose. Members were taught that loyalty was expected, but it was also cultivated through recognition, guidance, and inclusion. This combination of discipline and psychological insight allowed Hoover to maintain cohesion even under the pressures of rapid expansion and heightened visibility. The challenge of rival gangs became more pronounced during this period. As Hoover's influence grew, other organizations sought to test the limits of his authority. He responded with a measured combination of observation, negotiation, and strategic action. Rather than resorting to impulsive aggression, Hoover carefully evaluated the motivations, strengths, and weaknesses of rivals, using intelligence to guide his responses. Some conflicts were diffused through alliances or mutual understanding, while others required calculated shows of strength. Each engagement reinforced his reputation as a leader who relied on strategy rather than chaos, and whose influence extended beyond brute force into the realm of foresight and careful planning. Hoover's understanding of human behavior became an increasingly valuable asset. He observed and interpreted the motivations of both crew members and outsiders, using insight to maintain loyalty, anticipate threats, and guide decisions. Every interaction, whether a negotiation with a rival, a dispute within the crew, or a conversation with a community figure, provided information that could be leveraged strategically. This acute awareness of psychology, combined with operational discipline, allowed Hoover to shape outcomes rather than simply react to them, reinforcing both his personal authority and the stability of the organization. Community perception continued to serve as a subtle but essential tool. Hoover understood that influence extended beyond immediate members of the crew and into the neighborhoods they controlled. By maintaining a presence that was disciplined, strategic, and subtly omnipresent, he cultivated respect and, at times, a cautious admiration. Residents, local business owners, and peripheral allies responded to this image, often reinforcing the organization's authority simply through acknowledgement and compliance. This perception, carefully managed and maintained, allowed the Hoover crew to project power without constant enforcement, enhancing influence while minimizing risk. The organizational culture that Hoover fostered became a defining element of his leadership. Members were disciplined, strategically minded, and loyal, but they were also aware of the broader purpose and vision behind their actions. Hoover emphasized not only obedience but understanding. Each member was taught the significance of their role within the larger network, reinforcing accountability and cohesion. This culture of strategic engagement and shared purpose allowed the organization to adapt to challenges, maintain discipline under pressure, and sustain influence even in the face of evolving threats. Strategic foresight continued to underpin Hoover's operations. He anticipated not only immediate challenges but also long-term threats from law enforcement, rivals, and internal instability. Contingency planning, operational oversight, and succession considerations ensured that the organization could endure unexpected developments. Hoover's ability to manage complexity, mitigate risk, and leverage intelligence allowed him to maintain control over an increasingly intricate network, demonstrating a level of leadership that was both rare and remarkably effective. By the end of this period, Larry Hoover had solidified the Hoover crew as a disciplined, resilient, and strategically sophisticated organization. Loyalty, financial acumen, territorial control, and community perception were seamlessly integrated into a system capable of enduring external pressures and internal challenges. Rivals were cautious, law enforcement attentive, and allies confident in the stability and intelligence of the leadership. Hoover had transformed from a street-smart youth into a tactical, visionary leader whose influence extended well beyond the streets he controlled. Amid the quiet of Chicago nights, the distant hum of traffic, the flickering streetlights, and the subtle pulse of the urban environment, the Hoover crew operated with purpose, precision, and calculated authority. Every decision, alliance, and operation reflected Hoover's ability to combine strategy, psychology, and foresight. His empire, now firmly established and carefully maintained, was poised to face the next stage of challenge and opportunity. The foundation was secure, the crew loyal, and the vision clear. Larry Hoover's influence was no longer fleeting, and the organization he had meticulously constructed was ready to endure whatever trials lay ahead. As Larry Hoover's organization solidified its influence, the next challenge became navigating the intersection of power, perception, and personal ambition. By this point, the Hoover crew was no longer simply a street-level operation, it had become a structured, disciplined organization with clear hierarchies, loyal operatives, and a network of influence that extended well beyond the immediate neighborhoods of Chicago's South Side. Hoover's role had evolved from that of a tactical street leader into a strategist, capable of managing complex operations, anticipating threats, and shaping the environment in which the organization thrived. During this phase, Hoover increasingly focused on consolidating control over both internal and external domains. Internally, he worked to ensure that the crew remained cohesive, disciplined, and aligned with the broader vision. Ambition, personality conflicts, and occasional disputes were natural challenges within a growing organization, and Hoover approached these not with impulsive discipline but with calculated intervention. He recognized the importance of mediation, mentorship, and strategic delegation, balancing authority with inclusion. By fostering a sense of shared purpose and reinforcing loyalty, Hoover ensured that the crew operated as a unified network capable of executing coordinated action with precision. Externally, rival gangs, envious of Hoover's growing influence, sought opportunities to challenge the organization. These encounters tested both his leadership and strategic foresight. Rather than reacting impulsively, Hoover carefully assessed the strengths, weaknesses, and motivations of adversaries before committing to any course of action. Some conflicts were diffused through negotiation and subtle intimidation, while others required selective and controlled displays of power. Each engagement served as both a practical and symbolic reinforcement of authority, signaling to rivals, allies, and observers alike that Hoover's leadership was both intelligent and unassailable. Territorial control remained a critical aspect of the organization's strategy. Hoover approached neighborhoods, intersections, and critical areas as interconnected nodes in a larger network of influence. Control was exercised not through constant confrontation but through subtle, strategic presence, leveraging reputation, trusted lieutenants, and carefully monitored operations. Rivals who observed the Hoover crew often perceived an organization that was everywhere yet nowhere, disciplined yet adaptable, a perception that often discouraged direct challenges while reinforcing Hoover's authority across multiple fronts. Financial operations continued to advance in complexity and sophistication. Revenue streams were diversified, blending high-yield ventures with stable, long-term operations that reinforced the crew's influence and supported the network's resilience. Funds were allocated strategically, not only to reward loyalty and sustain operations but also to maintain influence and operational flexibility. Hoover understood that money was a tool of power, a means to extend reach, and a foundation for long-term stability. This careful integration of financial management with operational oversight ensured that the organization could endure both routine challenges and unexpected disruptions. Loyalty remained the bedrock of Hoover's leadership. He recognized that even the most disciplined organization could falter if members lacked commitment, trust, or a sense of shared purpose. Mentorship, recognition, and strategic reinforcement of loyalty were integral to his approach. Members were not only expected to follow directives but to understand the broader vision, contributing to a culture of accountability and engagement. This approach cultivated trust, reinforced hierarchy, and created bonds that were resilient under pressure, allowing the organization to navigate both internal and external challenges with cohesion. Community perception continued to serve as a subtle yet vital component of Hoover's strategy. Beyond the immediate crew, residents, business owners, and peripheral allies observed the organization's operations and evaluated its competence, discipline, and authority. By maintaining a reputation for intelligence, foresight, and measured control, Hoover projected power beyond physical presence alone. This perception not only enhanced influence but also discouraged unnecessary confrontation, allowing the organization to operate effectively while minimizing exposure to risk. Neighborhoods became both territory and symbol, representing an extension of Hoover's strategic presence and disciplined oversight. Conflict, both internal and external, became an instrument of consolidation during this period. Hoover understood that challenges, whether from ambitious members within the crew or from rival organizations, could be leveraged to reinforce hierarchy, demonstrate authority, and strengthen loyalty. Internal disputes were addressed with fairness and strategic insight, ensuring that resolutions reinforced cohesion and the shared vision. Encounters with rival gangs were managed with calculated precision, demonstrating capability without unnecessary escalation. Through these measured actions, Hoover maintained both stability and influence, solidifying his role as a leader whose intelligence and foresight transcended raw power. Strategic foresight continued to define Hoover's leadership. He anticipated not only immediate challenges but potential long-term threats, embedding resilience and adaptability into the organizational structure. Contingency plans, succession protocols, and operational oversight ensured that the crew could withstand disruptions, maintain cohesion, and continue to exert influence regardless of circumstances. Hoover's ability to plan for multiple eventualities while maintaining operational discipline allowed him to navigate the unpredictable dynamics of street life with a rare combination of calm and authority. By the conclusion of this period, Larry Hoover had cemented his status as a masterful strategist and influential leader. The Hoover crew operated with a level of discipline, coordination, and sophistication unmatched by many contemporaries. Loyalty, financial acumen, territorial control, and strategic perception were fully integrated into a system capable of enduring internal challenges and external pressures alike. Rivals were cautious, law enforcement attention increased, and allies trusted in both the stability of the organization and the intelligence of its leader. Hoover had transformed from a street-savvy youth into a visionary strategist whose influence extended far beyond the immediate neighborhoods of Chicago's South Side. Amid the quiet hum of the city, the flickering streetlights, the distant echoes of traffic, and the subtle rhythms of urban life, the Hoover crew operated with precision and purpose. Every decision, alliance, and action reflected a mind attuned to both immediate operational needs and long-term strategic goals. Hoover's leadership, patience, and insight had established a resilient, disciplined network capable of withstanding pressure, adapting to change, and expanding influence. The foundation had been laid for the next stage of his journey, where the interplay of power, loyalty, and external scrutiny would demand not only strategic acumen but also resilience, adaptability, and unwavering control over both his crew and the environment in which they thrived. As Larry Hoover's influence matured, a new set of challenges emerged, challenges that demanded not only strategic acumen but also careful navigation of perception, loyalty, and legal scrutiny. By this stage, the Hoover crew had evolved into a disciplined, multifaceted organization capable of complex operations, territorial management, and financial coordination. Yet with this growth came heightened visibility. Hoover understood that as the organization's power increased, so too did the scrutiny from law enforcement, rival factions, and even the community itself. Maintaining authority required a delicate balance of discretion, foresight, and psychological insight, a balance that would define the next chapter of his leadership. Internally, Hoover focused on reinforcing cohesion and discipline. The crew had expanded, and with expansion came the natural risk of internal friction. Personal ambitions, rivalries, and the differing temperaments of members required careful management. Hoover's approach was methodical. He mediated disputes, delegated responsibilities strategically, and implemented structures that encouraged accountability while reinforcing loyalty. Mentorship became a central tool, allowing him to guide members not only in operational tasks but in understanding the broader vision of the organization. Through these measures, he cultivated a culture of trust, respect, and shared purpose, ensuring that the crew remained unified even as its influence expanded. Externally, the landscape grew increasingly complex. Rival gangs were aware of Hoover's rising authority and often sought opportunities to challenge it. Yet Hoover's response was not reactive. Each potential confrontation was analyzed for strategic value, risk, and long-term consequence. Negotiation, alliance building, and selective shows of force were employed with precision, allowing the organization to assert dominance without unnecessary exposure. This careful calibration of action and restraint became a hallmark of Hoover's leadership, demonstrating a capacity for strategic thinking that transcended impulsive aggression. Rivals came to recognize that challenging the Hoover crew was not simply a matter of numbers or boldness, it required careful consideration of the intelligence and foresight of the leader at its helm. Territorial control continued to be a focal point of strategy. Hoover treated neighborhoods not as static domains but as dynamic networks of influence. Every street, intersection, and community block was assessed for its operational and symbolic value. Trusted lieutenants were placed strategically, ensuring that the crew maintained both presence and authority while projecting an aura of omnipresence that extended beyond direct observation. This subtle management of territory reinforced the organization's reputation, discouraging potential aggression and solidifying the crew's dominance across multiple layers of influence. Financial sophistication was another critical element of this phase. Hoover had developed a network of revenue streams that balanced high-yield ventures with more stable, long-term operations. Money was strategically deployed not only to fund operations but also to reinforce loyalty, reward performance, and ensure operational flexibility. For Hoover, finances were both practical and symbolic, a demonstration of the crew's capacity, stability, and foresight. Every financial decision was made with the awareness that resources were a tool for consolidating power and extending influence, strengthening the organization from within while projecting competence. Externally, community perception remained a subtle yet powerful tool in Hoover's arsenal. The organization's reputation for discipline, strategic intelligence, and controlled authority influenced not only allies and rivals but also neighborhood residents and local businesses. By maintaining an image of structured capability, Hoover ensured that influence extended beyond immediate operations. Perception, carefully managed and reinforced through strategic visibility and measured action, became a form of power in its own right, amplifying the crew's presence while reducing the need for constant enforcement. The psychological dimension of leadership continued to define Hoover's approach. He studied the motivations, fears, and aspirations of both crew members and outsiders, using this insight to anticipate behavior and guide decision-making. Loyalty was cultivated not through coercion alone but through recognition, mentorship, and the promise of shared success. Conflict, whether internal or external, was leveraged strategically to reinforce hierarchy, demonstrate authority, and maintain cohesion. Hoover's ability to blend operational strategy with psychological insight gave him a distinct advantage over rivals who relied primarily on intimidation or short-term tactics. Strategic foresight was particularly critical during this period. Hoover anticipated potential threats from law enforcement, rival factions, and internal instability, embedding resilience into the organization's structure. Contingency plans, oversight mechanisms, and operational protocols ensured that the crew could adapt to unexpected developments without compromising cohesion or influence. This long-term perspective allowed Hoover to operate with confidence, knowing that the organization was prepared for both foreseeable and unforeseen challenges. By the end of this period, Larry Hoover had solidified his position as a leader whose influence extended beyond immediate operations into the realms of perception, loyalty, and strategic foresight. The Hoover crew was disciplined, loyal, and sophisticated, capable of coordinated action, financial management, and adaptive response to both internal and external pressures. Rival gangs were wary of challenging the organization, law enforcement attention increased, and community perception reinforced the crew's authority. Hoover's leadership style, defined by patience, intelligence, and strategic calculation, ensured that the organization could thrive even in the volatile and unpredictable environment of Chicago's South Side. Amid the quiet of the urban night, the distant hum of traffic, the flickering streetlights, and the subtle rhythms of the neighborhood, the Hoover crew operated with precision, discipline, and purpose. Every decision, alliance, and operational move reflected Hoover's strategic vision, psychological insight, and ability to balance risk with opportunity. The organization had evolved into a resilient, structured network capable of enduring challenges, adapting to changing conditions, and sustaining influence over time. Larry Hoover's empire, carefully maintained and meticulously organized, was poised to face the next set of trials, where his foresight, leadership, and resilience would be tested on an even larger scale. As Larry Hoover's influence expanded, he began to face the intricate and often perilous intersection of power, loyalty, and external scrutiny. The Hoover crew had grown into a sophisticated network with clear hierarchies, operational discipline, and multiple revenue streams, yet with expansion came visibility, and with visibility came scrutiny from law enforcement, rival gangs, and the wider community. Hoover understood that leadership was no longer solely about managing territory or operations, it required foresight, strategic communication, and the delicate orchestration of perception and influence. Every decision carried weight, every action was scrutinized, and every alliance required careful management. Internally, the complexity of leadership intensified. The crew had expanded beyond its original structure, incorporating new members with varied ambitions, temperaments, and levels of experience. Hoover recognized that without careful management, ambition could transform into conflict, loyalty could waver, and cohesion could fracture. To mitigate these risks, he relied on a combination of mentorship, structured hierarchy, and consistent reinforcement of organizational values. Disputes were resolved not through impulsive discipline but through thoughtful mediation, with outcomes designed to reinforce loyalty, maintain cohesion, and clarify roles. Members learned to trust not only the rules of the organization but the judgment and fairness of its leader, cultivating a culture in which respect and shared purpose were as vital as obedience. Externally, the organization faced increasing pressure from rival gangs and growing attention from law enforcement. Rival factions, eager to challenge Hoover's expanding influence, sought opportunities to exploit perceived weaknesses. Yet Hoover's response was calculated and measured. He approached each potential confrontation as a strategic problem, analyzing the motivations, strengths, and vulnerabilities of adversaries before committing to action. Some conflicts were neutralized through negotiation, alliance building, or displays of subtle authority, while others required tactical demonstrations of power that reinforced his reputation without unnecessary escalation. These interactions highlighted Hoover's ability to balance assertiveness with restraint, a trait that distinguished him from more impulsive or short-sighted contemporaries. Territorial management became increasingly sophisticated. Hoover no longer viewed neighborhoods simply as zones to be controlled, he saw them as interlinked networks of influence. Key intersections, community hubs, and business districts were monitored strategically, with trusted lieutenants placed to maintain both visibility and operational control. This approach allowed the crew to extend its presence without constant confrontation, projecting an aura of omnipresence that shaped both allies' respect and rivals' caution. Every block, every corner, every street became part of a larger strategic landscape, demonstrating Hoover's ability to think beyond immediate gains toward long-term stability and influence. Financial sophistication was a cornerstone of this phase. Hoover had diversified revenue streams across both legitimate-seeming businesses and underground operations. Each initiative was carefully assessed for profitability, risk, and strategic value, ensuring that the organization maintained both financial stability and operational flexibility. Money was used not only to sustain operations but to reinforce loyalty, reward commitment, and cement alliances. In Hoover's hands, resources were a tool of influence, a symbol of the organization's discipline and capability, and a practical means to maintain resilience in the face of adversity. Community perception played a critical role in reinforcing Hoover's authority. Beyond the crew itself, local residents, business owners, and peripheral allies observed the organization's actions and reputation, forming judgments about its discipline, intelligence, and strategic competence. Hoover understood that perception could be leveraged as a subtle yet potent form of influence. By cultivating an image of calculated authority, he amplified the crew's presence and deterrence, often discouraging challenges and minimizing the need for direct confrontation. Neighborhoods became both operational domains and symbolic extensions of the organization's influence, reflecting Hoover's careful orchestration of both action and impression. Conflict management, both internal and external, remained a defining element of leadership. Hoover recognized that challenges could be used strategically to strengthen hierarchy, demonstrate authority, and reinforce cohesion. Internal disputes were addressed with fairness and strategic insight, ensuring that resolutions enhanced trust and clarified organizational structure. Encounters with rival gangs were approached with similar calculation, combining observation, intelligence, and tactical decision-making. Each engagement was an opportunity to reinforce authority, project competence, and sustain stability, illustrating Hoover's capacity to navigate complexity without resorting to reckless action. Psychological insight continued to distinguish Hoover's leadership style. He observed and interpreted the motivations, fears, and ambitions of both crew members and external actors, using this understanding to guide decisions, shape behavior, and anticipate challenges. Loyalty was cultivated through mentorship, recognition, and strategic engagement, rather than coercion alone. Conflict was leveraged as a tool for teaching, reinforcing hierarchy, and strengthening bonds, demonstrating Hoover's ability to integrate operational leadership with nuanced understanding of human behavior. Strategic foresight was central to Hoover's operations during this period. Anticipating potential threats from law enforcement, rival factions, and internal instability, he implemented contingency plans, operational protocols, and oversight mechanisms to ensure resilience. The organization was structured to adapt to unexpected developments without compromising cohesion, efficiency, or influence. Hoover's long-term perspective allowed him to balance immediate operational demands with the broader objective of sustaining power, projecting authority, and maintaining organizational integrity. By the end of this stage, Larry Hoover had solidified the Hoover crew as a disciplined, cohesive, and strategically sophisticated organization. Loyalty, territorial influence, financial acumen, and community perception were seamlessly integrated into a resilient system capable of withstanding both internal and external pressures. Rival gangs exercised caution, law enforcement intensified monitoring, and allies trusted in both the stability of the organization and the intelligence of its leadership. Hoover had transformed into more than a gang leader; he was a strategic architect, a visionary, and a figure whose foresight and methodical approach ensured enduring influence. Amid the quiet rhythm of Chicago nights, the distant hum of traffic, the flickering streetlights, and the subtle heartbeat of the neighborhoods, the Hoover crew operated with precision and purpose. Every decision, alliance, and operation reflected Hoover's unique combination of intelligence, patience, and foresight. The organization had evolved into a disciplined, resilient network capable of adapting to challenges, sustaining influence, and projecting authority over a growing sphere. Larry Hoover's empire, carefully constructed and meticulously maintained, was now poised for the next phase of its journey, where both internal ambition and external scrutiny would test the full measure of his leadership, strategic acumen, and ability to sustain control over a rapidly evolving environment. As Larry Hoover's organization reached a new level of sophistication, the complexity of leadership intensified. By this stage, the Hoover crew was no longer merely a network of street operatives; it had become a disciplined and structured organization with multi-layered hierarchies, financial systems, and an extensive sphere of influence that extended across neighborhoods, allies, and even peripheral networks beyond Chicago's South Side. Hoover's role had evolved from that of a tactical street leader into that of a strategist and architect, capable of navigating both the visible and hidden dynamics that govern power, loyalty, and influence. Internal cohesion became a central focus. The crew had grown in size and diversity, encompassing members with differing temperaments, ambitions, and levels of experience. Hoover understood that even a highly disciplined organization could fracture if loyalty wavered or ambition went unchecked. To address this, he implemented systems of mentorship, accountability, and structured responsibility. Disputes were mediated with care, ensuring that resolutions reinforced hierarchy and trust, rather than creating resentment or fragmentation. Each member was taught to understand their role within the larger organizational framework, cultivating a sense of purpose, alignment, and investment in the crew's shared vision. Territorial strategy was refined to a level of almost surgical precision. Hoover no longer viewed neighborhoods merely as spaces to be dominated, he saw them as interconnected nodes of influence, each with its own strategic value. Key blocks, intersections, and business corridors were mapped and monitored, with trusted lieutenants positioned to maintain both operational control and the perception of omnipresence. The organization's visibility was carefully calibrated, present enough to assert authority, yet subtle enough to avoid unnecessary confrontation. Rivals observed a disciplined and adaptive network, often deterred not by sheer numbers, but by the intelligence, coordination, and foresight exhibited by Hoover and his team. Financial operations continued to grow in both sophistication and strategic importance. Hoover had diversified revenue streams, balancing high-risk, high-reward ventures with more stable, long-term operations. Funds were allocated not only to sustain daily operations but also to reward loyalty, incentivize performance, and reinforce strategic alliances. Money in Hoover's hands was a tool of influence, a demonstration of organizational capacity, and a tangible expression of stability. By integrating financial acumen with operational oversight, he ensured that the crew remained resilient in the face of both economic and operational pressures. Community perception remained a subtle yet potent instrument of power. Hoover understood that influence extended beyond the immediate crew and that neighborhood perception could either bolster or undermine authority. By cultivating an image of discipline, intelligence, and strategic control, Hoover amplified his presence and reinforced the organization's dominance. Local residents, business owners, and even peripheral allies contributed to this perception, often responding in ways that strengthened the crew's position without direct enforcement. The organization's reputation became a self-reinforcing mechanism of influence, where respect and caution from the community extended the crew's reach far beyond its immediate operational footprint. Rival gangs continued to challenge Hoover's influence, yet his approach was deliberate and calculated. Each potential confrontation was analyzed for risk, reward, and long-term strategic impact. Hoover employed a combination of negotiation, selective displays of strength, and intelligence gathering to maintain authority while minimizing unnecessary conflict. He understood that impulsive aggression could destabilize both internal cohesion and external perception, and so he approached each situation with measured patience. By doing so, Hoover reinforced a reputation for intelligence, foresight, and strategic authority, a combination that often deterred challenges before they could materialize. Psychological insight was increasingly central to Hoover's leadership style. He carefully observed the motivations, fears, and ambitions of both crew members and external actors, using these insights to anticipate behavior and guide strategic decisions. Loyalty was cultivated not solely through fear or intimidation but through mentorship, recognition, and shared purpose. Internal conflicts were leveraged as opportunities to reinforce hierarchy and trust, ensuring that members remained aligned with the organization's goals while feeling valued and respected. This blend of operational strategy and psychological acuity allowed Hoover to maintain both cohesion and authority in a complex and unpredictable environment. Strategic foresight continued to define Hoover's operations. He anticipated not only immediate challenges but also potential long-term threats, whether from law enforcement, rival factions, or internal instability. Contingency plans, oversight mechanisms, and operational protocols were integrated into the organization's structure, providing resilience and adaptability. This proactive approach allowed the crew to navigate uncertainty with confidence, maintaining both stability and influence. Hoover's capacity to think multiple steps ahead became a hallmark of his leadership, demonstrating the rare ability to balance short-term operational needs with long-term organizational strategy. During this phase, Hoover also began to refine his approach to alliances and external relationships. He recognized that influence could be extended through networks of trust and mutual benefit, rather than relying solely on direct control. Partnerships with other crews, community figures, and peripheral networks were cultivated strategically, enhancing the organization's reach and providing access to intelligence, resources, and support. These alliances reinforced the crew's authority while also embedding Hoover's influence within a broader social and operational ecosystem. By the conclusion of this stage, Larry Hoover had transformed the Hoover crew into a disciplined, resilient, and strategically sophisticated organization. Loyalty, territorial control, financial management, and community perception were seamlessly integrated into a network capable of withstanding internal and external pressures alike. Rivals approached interactions with caution, law enforcement monitored operations closely, and allies placed trust in the intelligence and stability of Hoover's leadership. The organization had evolved beyond a mere street gang, it had become a system of influence, strategy, and disciplined authority, reflecting the careful planning, foresight, and insight of its leader. Amid the quiet of Chicago's urban landscape, the flickering streetlights, distant traffic hums, and subtle rhythms of the neighborhoods, the Hoover crew operated with purpose, precision, and silent authority. Every action, alliance, and operational decision reflected Hoover's unique blend of intelligence, patience, and strategic foresight. The organization had matured into a resilient, adaptable, and cohesive network capable of projecting influence far beyond the immediate streets. Larry Hoover's empire, carefully constructed and meticulously maintained, was poised to enter its next phase, where the interplay of power, loyalty, and external pressures would test the full extent of his leadership, strategic vision, and capacity to sustain authority in an ever-changing environment. As Larry Hoover's organization reached its peak levels of sophistication, the challenges of leadership became increasingly complex and multifaceted. The Hoover crew was no longer simply a street-level network of operatives, it had evolved into a highly structured, disciplined, and strategically oriented organization. Hoover himself had transitioned fully from a tactical street leader into a visionary strategist, capable of orchestrating operations across neighborhoods, financial networks, and alliances with a level of precision that few of his contemporaries could match. Every decision now carried implications far beyond the immediate environment, and every action had to be carefully considered in light of both internal cohesion and external perception. Internal management became an art of psychological insight, discipline, and strategic foresight. Hoover recognized that loyalty was fragile and ambition, if left unchecked, could threaten organizational stability. He implemented systems to monitor behavior, reinforce commitment, and nurture trust. Mentorship remained a central pillar of his approach, guiding members not only in operational tasks but in understanding their role within the larger organizational vision. Conflict resolution was handled with care, ensuring that disagreement strengthened rather than weakened the crew's structure. Every member was made aware of their value, responsibility, and place within a hierarchy that balanced authority with respect. This careful calibration of leadership fostered unity and resilience, allowing the organization to operate seamlessly even under pressure. Externally, the dynamics of power required increasingly nuanced strategies. Rival gangs were aware of Hoover's growing influence and often tested the organization's boundaries. Hoover approached each confrontation with a measured and analytical mindset. Observation, intelligence gathering, and strategic assessment preceded every action. Negotiation, selective displays of strength, and alliance building were employed judiciously, allowing the organization to assert dominance without unnecessary escalation. These carefully orchestrated responses not only reinforced Hoover's authority but also cultivated a reputation for intelligence, foresight, and controlled power, a reputation that often deterred challenges before they could materialize. Territorial influence became increasingly refined. Hoover viewed neighborhoods as interconnected systems rather than isolated domains, understanding that control over key intersections, business corridors, and social hubs created both practical and symbolic authority. Trusted lieutenants were positioned strategically, ensuring that operations were coordinated, visibility was maintained, and influence extended across the community without overt displays of force. This subtle projection of power created an impression of omnipresence, enhancing both the crew's operational efficiency and its psychological impact on rivals and observers alike. Every street, block, and corner became part of a calculated network, reinforcing Hoover's strategic vision and the organization's long-term stability. Financial operations continued to expand in scope and sophistication. Revenue streams were diversified to balance high-yield ventures with stable, long-term operations. Funds were allocated with strategic intent, to sustain operations, reward loyalty, incentivize performance, and reinforce alliances. Money in Hoover's hands was both practical and symbolic, a tangible expression of organizational competence, stability, and influence. The careful management of resources allowed the crew to remain adaptable, resilient, and capable of responding to both internal challenges and external pressures, further solidifying the organization's strategic foundation. Community perception remained a subtle but potent element of influence. Hoover understood that the organization's authority extended beyond the immediate crew, shaping the attitudes of residents, business owners, and peripheral allies. By cultivating an image of discipline, intelligence, and measured power, Hoover amplified the crew's presence without relying on constant enforcement. Neighborhoods became not just operational zones but extensions of the organization's influence, where perception reinforced control and minimized unnecessary conflict. The crew's reputation became a strategic asset, shaping interactions and deterring challenges before they arose. The psychological dimension of leadership became increasingly critical. Hoover observed and interpreted the motivations, fears, and ambitions of both crew members and external actors, using these insights to anticipate behavior and guide decisions. Loyalty was cultivated through mentorship, recognition, and shared purpose, rather than coercion alone. Internal conflicts were leveraged strategically to reinforce hierarchy, strengthen trust, and teach members about the principles of organizational cohesion. Hoover's ability to blend operational strategy with nuanced understanding of human behavior allowed the crew to function effectively even in volatile and unpredictable circumstances. Strategic foresight defined this phase of Hoover's leadership. Anticipating threats from law enforcement, rival factions, and potential internal instability, he implemented contingency plans, operational protocols, and oversight mechanisms that ensured resilience. The organization was structured to adapt to challenges without compromising cohesion or influence. Hoover's ability to think several steps ahead allowed him to balance immediate operational demands with long-term strategic goals, maintaining authority, projecting power, and reinforcing the organization's stability simultaneously. Alliances and external relationships became increasingly strategic. Hoover recognized that influence could be extended through networks of mutual benefit, trust, and cooperation. Partnerships with other crews, community leaders, and peripheral networks enhanced the organization's reach, provided access to intelligence and resources, and reinforced Hoover's authority. These alliances were managed with care, ensuring that they supported the crew's goals while strengthening Hoover's reputation as a calculated and visionary leader. Every connection, negotiation, and collaboration reflected deliberate planning and strategic foresight. By the end of this phase, Larry Hoover had cemented his status as a masterful strategist and influential leader. The Hoover crew operated with discipline, cohesion, and efficiency, integrating loyalty, territorial control, financial management, and community perception into a sophisticated, resilient network. Rival gangs approached interactions with caution, law enforcement closely monitored activities, and allies trusted the stability and intelligence of Hoover's leadership. The organization had transcended its origins as a street-level operation, becoming a structured, adaptive, and influential system under the careful guidance of its visionary leader. Amid the quiet of Chicago nights, the distant hum of traffic, flickering streetlights, and the subtle rhythm of the neighborhoods, the Hoover crew operated with purpose, precision, and silent authority. Every decision, alliance, and operational maneuver reflected Hoover's intelligence, patience, and strategic vision. The organization had matured into a network capable of sustaining influence, adapting to challenges, and projecting authority across a complex urban landscape. Larry Hoover's empire, meticulously maintained and carefully constructed, was poised to face the next chapter of trials, where the full interplay of internal ambition, external scrutiny, and organizational complexity would test the limits of his leadership, strategic foresight, and capacity to maintain enduring control. As Larry Hoover's influence reached its zenith, the complexities of leadership, strategy, and loyalty intertwined more than ever. The Hoover crew was no longer merely a gang or street organization, it had become a multifaceted, disciplined, and highly structured network, operating with precision across financial operations, territorial control, alliances, and community perception. Hoover himself had transformed into a strategist and architect of influence, able to anticipate challenges, navigate complex social dynamics, and orchestrate operations with an almost surgical precision. Yet, as influence grew, so did scrutiny, from law enforcement, rival gangs, and even members within his own organization. Hoover understood that maintaining authority in this environment required a delicate balance of foresight, discipline, and psychological insight. Internally, the demands of leadership had become intricate and layered. The crew had expanded significantly, incorporating individuals with diverse ambitions, temperaments, and experiences. Hoover recognized that internal instability could emerge if ambition turned into rivalry or if loyalty wavered. To prevent fractures, he relied on mentorship, structured hierarchy, and deliberate reinforcement of organizational values. Disputes were addressed thoughtfully, with resolutions designed to strengthen cohesion, clarify roles, and maintain mutual respect. Members were taught to understand their importance within the organizational framework, fostering investment in the crew's collective goals. Loyalty was not simply expected, it was nurtured through recognition, guidance, and strategic engagement. Territorial influence remained central to the organization's operations. Hoover approached neighborhoods as dynamic networks of interlinked influence rather than static territories. Strategic nodes, key intersections, and business corridors were carefully monitored, and trusted lieutenants were positioned to maintain both operational control and subtle visibility. This method of management created a sense of omnipresence, signaling authority while minimizing the need for overt displays of power. Rivals often hesitated to challenge the crew, not because of sheer numbers, but because of the calculated intelligence, discipline, and foresight evident in every operation. Hoover's approach turned geography itself into a strategic asset, reinforcing both operational control and psychological dominance. Financial management continued to evolve in sophistication. Hoover had diversified revenue streams across both overt and covert operations, balancing high-risk ventures with stable, long-term initiatives. Resources were allocated strategically to sustain operations, reward loyalty, incentivize performance, and reinforce alliances. Money was not simply currency, it was a tool of influence, a symbol of organizational strength, and a tangible measure of strategic capability. Hoover's careful oversight of finances allowed the crew to maintain adaptability, ensuring resilience even under shifting pressures or unexpected challenges. Community perception was another vital component of Hoover's strategy. Beyond the immediate crew, the organization's actions influenced the attitudes of local residents, business owners, and peripheral allies. Hoover understood that perception could be as powerful as direct control. By projecting an image of disciplined intelligence, calculated authority, and strategic foresight, he reinforced the crew's influence while minimizing confrontation. Neighborhoods became not only operational domains but also symbolic extensions of the organization's reach, where subtle control and carefully cultivated reputation amplified the crew's power. The challenges posed by rival gangs grew more pronounced as Hoover's reputation spread. These encounters required a delicate blend of strategy, negotiation, and tactical display. Hoover assessed the strengths, weaknesses, and intentions of adversaries before committing to action. Negotiation and alliance building were preferred where possible, with displays of strength reserved for situations where subtle deterrence proved insufficient. Every interaction reinforced the perception of disciplined authority and strategic intelligence. Hoover's ability to respond without succumbing to impulsive aggression distinguished him from others who relied on brute force, creating a reputation that often dissuaded conflict before it could arise. Psychological insight became an increasingly critical aspect of leadership. Hoover observed and interpreted the behavior, motivations, and fears of crew members and external actors alike. Loyalty was cultivated through mentorship, recognition, and shared purpose rather than intimidation alone. Internal conflicts were leveraged strategically to reinforce hierarchy, strengthen trust, and clarify roles within the organization. By understanding the human dimension of influence, Hoover ensured that the crew functioned effectively even under pressure, and that organizational cohesion remained intact despite external and internal challenges. Strategic foresight continued to underpin every operation. Hoover anticipated potential threats from law enforcement, rival gangs, and internal instability. Contingency plans, oversight mechanisms, and operational protocols were integrated into the organization's structure, providing resilience and adaptability. This forward-thinking approach allowed the crew to maintain stability and influence, even amidst uncertainty. Hoover's capacity to plan multiple steps ahead enabled him to balance immediate operational demands with long-term organizational goals, preserving authority, projecting power, and reinforcing the crew's stability simultaneously. Alliances and external networks were carefully managed during this period. Hoover recognized that influence extended beyond direct control. It could be amplified through relationships built on trust, mutual benefit, and strategic alignment. Collaborations with other crews, community leaders, and peripheral networks enhanced the organization's reach, provided access to intelligence, and reinforced Hoover's authority. Each alliance was approached thoughtfully, ensuring that it supported the crew's strategic objectives while solidifying Hoover's reputation as a deliberate, intelligent, and visionary leader. Every negotiation and connection reflected careful planning and operational foresight. By the conclusion of this phase, Larry Hoover had transformed the Hoover crew into a disciplined, cohesive, and strategically sophisticated organization capable of sustaining influence across multiple dimensions. Loyalty, territorial control, financial management, and community perception were seamlessly integrated into a resilient network able to withstand both internal and external pressures. Rivals approached encounters with caution, law enforcement maintained heightened scrutiny, and allies placed trust in the intelligence and stability of Hoover's leadership. The organization had transcended its origins, evolving into a system of strategic influence, operational discipline, and enduring authority. Amid the quiet of Chicago nights, the soft hum of distant traffic, flickering streetlights casting long shadows across neighborhoods, and the subtle pulse of urban life, the Hoover crew operated with precision, purpose, and silent authority. Every decision, alliance, and tactical maneuver reflected Hoover's intelligence, patience, and foresight. The organization had matured into a resilient, adaptable network capable of projecting influence, sustaining operations, and navigating the complexities of urban power. Larry Hoover's empire, meticulously constructed and carefully maintained, was now ready to confront the next chapter, where the interplay of ambition, scrutiny, and external pressures would challenge his leadership, strategic vision, and ability to preserve control over a vast and intricate network. Even behind bars, Larry Hoover's name carried an echo that refused to fade. In the neighborhoods of Chicago's South Side, his legend was whispered like scripture. Some called him a prophet, others a tyrant. His word, though delivered from the walls of a cell, still shaped lives on the streets. For many of the young and lost, Larry said, was enough to settle disputes, to create rules, to command silence. It was as if the man himself had become an idea, part myth, part memory, and part mirror to the chaos that surrounded his city. Prison didn't erase his influence, it concentrated it. Through coded letters and filtered messages, his vision of order, sometimes righteous, sometimes ruthless, continued to travel far beyond the bars. Supporters described him as a man of evolution, someone who wanted to transition from gang power to community power. They saw him as a teacher urging his people toward education, self-discipline, and business. But for others, the transformation seemed like a calculated performance, a tactic to regain control over a fractured empire from the inside. Still, there was something hauntingly magnetic about his duality. Even his enemies admitted that Hoover understood something fundamental about power, that it wasn't about fear alone, but about belief. People followed him not because they had to, but because they wanted to believe in something larger than themselves, even if that belief was built on a shadow. With time, "Free Larry Hoover" became more than a slogan. It became a symbol of defiance, a protest against a system many saw as unjust. Celebrities, activists, and musicians echoed his name, rapping it in the language of reform and redemption. Songs were written, shirts printed, murals painted, all with the image of a man who hadn't walked free in decades, yet somehow stood at the center of urban mythology. But beneath the chants and headlines, the truth was more complex. The streets Hoover once ruled had changed. The organizations he built had splintered, each claiming his legacy but losing his control. Some turned to peace, others to chaos. His idea of unity, once powerful, had become a ghost of its former self, a reminder that even the strongest empire cannot survive without its architect. In the stillness of night, as the city's lights flickered over the skyline, Larry Hoover remained both present and absent. His myth lived on in stories told by those who had never even met him. The idea of him, of order through power, of respect through fear, still lingered in alleyways, classrooms, and conversations. Yet the man himself sat in silence, aging behind the same walls that had tried, and failed, to erase his name. As the years slipped by, Larry Hoover's story began to settle into something deeper than crime or punishment. It became a meditation on power, transformation, and the cost of legacy. He entered the system as a young man intoxicated by authority, and decades later, he remained imprisoned, not just by walls, but by the myth his own name had created. To some, he symbolized everything broken about America's justice system, a man who had grown beyond his crimes, yet remained buried under the weight of them. To others, he was still the architect of one of the most formidable organizations in the nation's history, responsible for generations of violence and fear. Somewhere between those extremes lay the truth, an imperfect man whose life became a reflection of the world around him. Even now, the debate continues. Was Larry Hoover a visionary who sought to lead his people from darkness into progress? Or was he a manipulator who cloaked control in the language of unity? Perhaps, like many figures of power, he was both, driven by ambition, trapped by circumstance, and reshaped by time. His voice, when heard in rare interviews, carried the calm cadence of someone who had seen everything and lost everything. There was no more bravado, no more posturing, only reflection. Outside, his name still circulates like a current through hip-hop lyrics and social discussions. The "Free Larry Hoover" movement remains alive, sustained by generations who see him as a symbol of resistance. Yet for all the noise, the man himself sits in silence, watching history reinterpret his story again and again. Maybe that's how all legends end, not with an explosion, but with an echo. Larry Hoover's legacy is neither clean nor simple. It is carved from contradiction, discipline and destruction, leadership and loss, evolution and entrapment. His story reminds us that power, once tasted, never truly leaves the soul. It lingers, reshaped, reimagined, immortalized. As the final chapter closes, one image remains, a man sitting alone in his cell, surrounded by decades of choices, both his and those of the world that created him. Outside, his city keeps moving, its streets alive with dreams, danger, and the distant hum of a name that refuses to be forgotten. Larry Hoover, the man who tried to build a nation from behind bars, and in doing so, became a myth that time itself could not contain.